a quorum, so we're just going to get started and hope the rest trickle in. Our very first item on our agenda is the public benefit analysis of disposition of real property at 320 East 400 South and 338 East 400 South, known as the Exchange. I want to set the stage a little bit, and then we will have David Litvack. There you are. Give us a bit of an introduction. We'll invite Han to come up after that. But this is a unique project. I know that the developer is here, and typically we don't have a presentation by the developer at these loan request work sessions, but I'm going to ask my peers to waive those rules in a moment, and if we could allow the developer to have 5 minutes to present to us after hand. But the uniqueness of this project as it's come together and the way that it's been processed has identified some policy objectives that we don't intend to implement on this project today, but that we do feel, and the council will have a discussion toward the end of this agenda item, but we do feel that there's an urgency for us to address these items. And council members, if I could talk to you for just a moment, as we talked in our RDA meeting just in the last hour, that we threw the doors wide open on affordable housing in this city. We put money down, we clarified tools, and we created new tools to expand affordable housing, and I think successfully so in Salt Lake City. And that's not an easy thing to do, as we've come to learn. And yet, as we've created these new tools and funding options, I think that we are beginning to see that we need to create some more clear policy guidelines around how those tools are combined and what the net benefit is to any given developer. And so the council and our staff commit to working with the administration on these concerns and thoughts that we have, and we'll dialogue more about that later in this agenda item. So David Litvack, our Mayor's Deputy Chief of Staff, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry, David. I also need to recognize Jennifer Bruno and
I'll recognize
Cindy
Jennifer.
Lou also. Thank you for your help.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to just make a couple quick comments. One, I do want to express my appreciation, Madam Chair, for your opening remarks. I also want to express appreciation for the conversation that we just had with an RDA and share the sentiment that we as an administration are looking forward to having that policy conversation and some of the learning that came out of this process, and we're always willing to improve that process and to improve that policy. So we thank you for highlighting that and look forward to working on that collaboratively with the council and with council staff. I'd also like to acknowledge all the tremendous amount of work that has been put into this project, actually for quite a long time, for the last year and a half or so, with our administrative staff and the council staff working so hard on this project as well. So thank you. I just want to, Madam Chair, if I may, just quickly state that for the administration, forwarding the public benefit analysis and knowing that there's learning and improvements that will come from that, we feel very strongly that this project, the Exchange project, is a great opportunity to make headway in our shared goal of affordable housing, and particularly deeply affordable housing. There's a lot of benefit to this project that we think the public benefit analysis shows that outweighs the costs associated with it, whether it be the affordable housing, the innovative micro units, the economic development, incubator space, all that stuff, which we'll get into, but acknowledging how important that deeply affordable piece is, 50% AMI and below. And I have to reveal a little bit of a bias because I've kind of clung on to one aspect of this that I think is obviously is very unique, has and may show some another strategy going forward, is that we're able to do this with the 4% tax credit instead of what is typically used in these types of projects, the 9%. And there's trade-offs, and Jennifer and I have had this conversation. There's trade-offs between 9% and 4%, but the ability to show a project like this can work at 4% will give us some tools in our toolbox that maybe weren't there before, and allow us to have some of those trade-off types of conversations moving forward with this. I clung on to that because, as Cindy knows, we have this conversation quite a bit in the Salt Lake City Housing Authority, and understand how absolutely competitive that 9% process is and some of the inherent limitations of that process. So I have my own little bias on that 4% piece, but we look forward. We really appreciate the opportunity and also the acknowledgement of council to call that special meeting so that we can move this project forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Litvak. We'd like to invite Han to come up, Melissa Jensen. I understand you have a presentation for us.
Thank you. Bailey White is going to help me out moving through the presentation. I appreciate the time and your attention for being here. I won't repeat what David said. I think it's clear that we have an opportunity here on this project, and we're here today because of a public benefit analysis. With that in mind, this transaction is complex. There's no doubt about that. My team has worked for the better part of a year on this transaction, its challenges and its changes. The work has been done with the city's best interest in mind. And what I mean by that is that we underwrote the project. When we underwrote the project, we first and foremost sought to invest in an economically feasible and viable project. And then we balanced the merits of those economics of the transaction with the public policy goals we wish to achieve. The terms of the proposed public benefit analysis are based on what I would consider a conservative underwriting approach. And while the margin for repayment is slim, we are quite confident that there is sufficient surplus cash flow on each parcel, and we'll get into what that looks like, to make the city whole. And so we can talk more about that. I think just to provide some framework, there's a lot of words on this slide. You all mostly wrote a lot of the policy that's here, so I'm not going to repeat it. There's just a couple that stand out for me, and that is the utilization of land in our transactions, the commitment to deeply affordable housing, and mixed income, and then equitability, especially when a project's not in an area of opportunity. So that's on the left. On the right, you kind of see just to the two basic frameworks that we used in terms of the disposition of this property. There was an RFP process, a public process, and the development group that's here today is the one that was unanimously selected. And we are here, of course, as a reminder because of the below market terms that we're proposing on this transaction, and they're focused on those 4 areas that you see above as identified in the analysis you have in your packet. I think I wanted to just provide some context. One benefit we have when we do a request for proposals is we get to lay out for the community at large public policy goals that are important to us in terms of a development. The most recent 2 are, of course, Violin Commons and this potential project, the Exchange. This project is large. It's over $107 million in a transaction. The city's total investment as proposed here today is about 8% of the total transaction. While different from housing trust funds, this is in line similarly with the loans that we've seen in the past. In addition, the use of 4% tax credits, I'm not going to repeat David. I think he did a fine job of talking about that balance, but it's certainly something that is going to produce, over 400 units total and, 200 affordable units. To the right, there are a few transaction-specific components that I think are important to call out. And the first 2 kind of speak to the need for additional financing and the change in construction costs, among others, and the primary lender, Freddie Mac, and some of the requirements around that. The third, I think, is situationally unique to this project, as the lot line was wrong in the survey, which ultimately resulted in the decision to purchase the 10 feet needed to complete the originally planned parcel. So moving on to the next slide, you kind of see the deal components that are laid out before you, the sources and uses for the project. It requires quite a bit more public subsidy than a 9% tax credit would, although we are seeing those come back for additional subsidy because of rising costs. In our process, in terms of just kind of talking about how we think about this transaction and have thought about it over the years, is we analyze lots of different scenarios when we look at these, and we think about the coulds and woulds and what ifs, and that's part of what we do in our underwriting process as we put these loans forward. And ultimately, the way that the transaction shaked out was 3 different loans on each parcel, and we underwrote each of those according to their appropriate surplus cash flow. We also looked at the parcel in different combinations together as part of evaluation and just looking at different lenses for that project. I want to just briefly highlight the debt coverage ratios that are on each loan. This is B focused. The residential A, you should know, is has a higher cash flow. I think we're at a 2.14. I'm going to look at Bailey to double check that for me. Residential only is about 1.05 debt coverage ratio. And then the B commercial, which is sort of the incubator space, we actually underwrote at a 75% occupancy. We thought that was a conservative approach to determine what kind of cash flow that would be should they not be able to keep that at capacity. And that got us to a 1.04 debt coverage ratio. I'm happy to talk more about those or some of the analysis that we did or the scenarios. But in short, we believe that this transaction reaches both public policy goals and economic feasibility. This slide 5 is just contextual in terms of consistent transaction components. The complexity of this deal merits discussion and certainly understanding of how these tools work together, and appreciate Council Chair Mendenhall's remarks in terms of guiding policy as we go forward in how that public benefit is used together or not. You have sort of a seller note, which is long-term financing of the land. You have low-interest financing. You have long-term debt. And then, of course, you have a land write-down. Pieces of these transactions are evident in other transactions that we have done via the Housing Trust Fund or recently Violin Commons. Together, I think they provide a new transaction. And I think it's important to mention, too, that every time we do an RFP, there's different public policy goals, and that produces a different economic model for that project to work. And so we always have to contemplate that as we negotiate and underwrite the transaction. With that, I will stop talking, and I'm happy to.
You can just stay there if you want.
I'm
have to go anywhere.
happy to stay here.
So at this time is, to my peers, this is when I would ask if you are willing to suspend our rules and invite the developer to take the 5 minutes that we would usually ask if you have questions of the developer, and allow them to make a presentation, which questions could come after if you'd like to. Are you okay with us inviting them up for a presentation? Not seeing any nays, so we'll invite the developer up. And you may have 5 minutes to make a presentation, because that's what we do. And then if there's questions that come after, you can stay as long as you're willing to answer our questions.
Hi, my name is Chris Barker. I'm with Give Development and Give Communities.
I'm Matt Schwartz with the Domain Companies.
And
Thank you.
We appreciate being able to present before you guys today. Since we're saving some time, we'll skip through a few of these. I thought I'd take a few minutes to just talk about how this project came to be. It's a very unusual project for our group to do. Give Development primarily does 9% mixed income, mixed use tax credit deals. Give Communities primarily does deep need affordable housing facilitation. Right now we're doing 2 projects of permanent supportive housing with both the VOA and the Housing Authority of Salt Lake City. And that's kind of our wheelhouse. How many units can we get? What price points can we get them at? How many people can we help? And over doing that for the last several years, though I'm deeply proud of the work we've been doing, it became apparent that that just wasn't going to cut it for our housing problem. The amount of 9% tax credits available in the market in any given year is less than the amount of population growth in the state. We're going to lose this battle unless we find ways that don't require 9% tax credits. So when this RFP came out, I started going through a list of things that I would like to prove with it in an ideal scenario. And there were three main things. The number one thing was, what can you do for housing generally in a model? How can you build something without 9% in using funding sources that typically aren't tapped out, which primarily 4% aren't. In every given year, there's bond allocation that isn't used. So truly, if you can build a model that uses 4%, you are adding units to an overall market instead of just robbing Peter to pay Paul from another part of the state with 9%. The second thing is, what can we prove on 400 South? There's a laundry list of things that developers typically say you can't do. Well, you can't put ground floor retail on the bottom. You can't really mix uses. You can't do a high-end market project with any affordable, otherwise your market units won't be able to be rented. So an ideal scenario would have been one that disproves all of those points, so that we can get a 4th South corridor that has a proof of concept that really makes it so those sort of statements can't be said with any sort of validity. And the third thing is, what's the appropriate thing to have as an anchor of what is basically the civic core of Salt Lake City? What does it mean to be right next to the public library? What does it mean to be next to the public safety building? What do we want here? And for me, ideally, that was something that was massively available to everybody. You would have housing that someone making $500,000 could use, as well as someone making half of median income. You would have economic opportunity for people that might be starting a new tech business, as well as someone who might be starting a new food business where they're coming out of working in the food industry themselves and don't have much money. And so GIVE kind of went on a national looking tour. We asked all the financiers that we'd talked to in some of our other projects about who they felt the best people in the nation were that were doing this sort of work. We came up with three main people, one of which was Domain. I went ahead and had the privilege of touring through some of their New Orleans developments. And what struck me is, instead of being a developer that did one thing, they would walk you through a neighborhood that had a restaurant next to a grocery store, next to a high-rise condo development, next to a deeply affordable housing project, next to a boutique hotel, all of which they had built because that's what the neighborhood needed, rather than building whatever it was that happened to fit in their wheelhouse and just pounding that nail. And when I saw that, relative to the other developers, I knew that we wanted them in our market. I knew that we wanted them in our market for a long time, and I knew they'd be the right partner for this project. So that's kind of who Matt is. They do some excellent work in other parts of the country, and that kind of led us to the Exchange project. Do you want to talk at all, or should I just do this whole thing?
I'll chime in.
So the Exchange project does all of those objectives. Basically, you've got Building A, which is the first affordable steel construction building in the state. One of the things you're told you can't do is build residential rental at anything higher than 5 stories. You're supposed to only be able to do that in wood. The other thing that does, it's an 80-20 deal, which is done very kind of in high quantities on the East and West Coast. But it's proving that market developments that are getting truly top of market rents can incorporate something like 50% AMI housing and still get those rents, which again is something you're not supposed to be able to do in Utah, but we have to find a way to do if we're going to attack this problem. There's enough market rate units being built in this city and this state that if 10 to 20% of them went affordable, if you can prove that model, we wouldn't have a housing problem. So it was important to me that we go ahead and prove that model out. This will be probably the premier residential rental project in the state. And if we can prove that you can add 40 and 50% AMI units to that project and still get those rents, the excuses for not doing it go away. On the ground floor, you have one of my favorite aspects, a food space. It's basically a large food hall. It provides economic mobility to people starting a food business. Instead of having to spend $250,000 to start a restaurant and all the tooling and basically leverage your life if you have an idea, here you can rent a spot where everything's basically taken care of for you for less than $1,000 a month. It removes the barrier to attempting the American dream for people who typically don't have all of the resources to start a new restaurant. And so having the economic driver for both low-income people, as well as what you'll find in Building B, which is a large incubation space for more traditional kind of, tech and philanthropic enterprises that are typically going to be higher income, having having a place where you can go regardless of what level of business you're trying to start within the same development seemed like the right thing to do as part of this civic core. The rest of Building B, apart from the retail on the bottom, is the first 40% AMI units to be built in this state using 4% credits ever. They're also an interesting micro-unit kind of proof of concept. So it's a very unusual project for us, both in size and definitely in scale. But the reason we really wanted Domain to be a part of it and why we're really excited about it is the ramifications that come from the project that really have nothing to do with this exact building. There's a host of things that Salt Lake and Utah generally need to prove can be done if we're going to make real strides in every single one of those categories. So we're really excited about it.
Thanks, Chris. And you barely went over 5 minutes. So that was pretty good. I know I've seen the slides of the presentation. I know there's a lot more information that council members have access to. It's in our paper packets. It's online for the public as well. And now we can open it up to questions from council members that, do you have any questions for the developers? I think this sounds like an amazing project, really an amazing project.
Thanks.
And a focus, very tuned focus on a specific need that's going unmet, and we appreciate, as private developers, your interest in finding ways to not just fulfill the need, but prove the concept. Council members, any questions? I saw one brewing in you. Go ahead, Councilmember Johnston.
Thanks for your presentation, and I'm intrigued by the food hall. To expand a little bit, this is a step beyond an incubator kitchen because you'll have a retail or a common sort of a common space dining hall area to it.
Correct. Basically, the idea is if you wanted to start a restaurant, you literally could walk in with a dream and $1,000 and start one. You could prove out your menus. You could prove out whether or not even the restaurant business is for you. Typically, that barrier is far closer to $100,000 or $200,000. So you'll have common seating in there, and you'll have 8 to 10 restaurants.
Okay.
It's kind of like a food court at a mall, except much higher end and far more authentic. This is happening quite a bit in the markets that Matt does. He
Is
has
it like a small man galley?
kind of, yeah. It kind of is how food is going. I'll let you talk a little bit to the models that you've looked at in the markets that you work at.
Yeah, we've toured a number of different examples of this, and one of the exciting things in working these into mixed income developments is, or mixed use developments, is the amount of activity that they generate. So in really looking how we were going to program that retail, one of the objectives was activating the street scene, generating a vibrant street scene and mix of uses. And we've really seen these type of spaces do that around the country and in the markets that we're in. So we're excited about working it into the project from that element too. We positioned it on the corner for that reason, and it's part of a whole complement of uses that we programmed, ranging from that space as the largest use to the retail space in Building B, which we designed with, purposefully designed with smaller bays to act as somewhat of incubator spaces for smaller retailers or restaurateurs that would be graduating out of that space.
Okay. So one of my questions then is this partially partially dependent on having alcohol sales in there?
It is primarily food.
I've just seen I've seen these other, we saw this in Pittsburgh just a month ago, and really the bar was a big piece of sort of activating the space, and that's my question about if that's a dependent piece of this. It's something to think about is in proximity to the square and some other issues around Salt Lake City that are unique to us.
Yeah, I think it's an important consideration. I mean, we in the examples that we've seen done well, that is a very small component of it, And it's really not the focus, really anything we've talked about and how we've envisioned this space and how we're thinking about programming it. We're very cognizant of those type of things because we're really looking at the whole development holistically and making sure that, we don't want to do anything that's detrimental to the project.
Madam Chair.
Councilmember Rogers.
Thank you. I have two questions, and you touched on it briefly right now, is on the incubator space. If you had your druthers, since we discussed this, and for me, I hate to see us invest in money in some sort of incubator space where we have the private market that's competing against it. Do you see that space is, since its inception, can you use that space as something else, or is it something that you have programmed in moving forward that you are set on with incubator space?
I think one of the exciting things about this model is the way that space is leveraged into a co-working space. And there really are so many different things going on within that space, which helps the incubator be successful, but it really doesn't have to stand on its own and carry the entire project. When we did our first co-working and incubator space, one of the things we did was tour around the country to a number of different markets, particularly focused on markets like Seattle and Silicon Valley that had a lot of that type of activity. And where we really saw them being successful is where they were integrated into a larger platform. And so with our space, that's what we did. In the last one we did, we partnered with an incubator space called the Idea Village that it is probably less than 5% of the total square footage in the space. But what they do bring is, in addition to all the work they do as an incubator or as an accelerator, they bring an energy and an activity to the space that makes other tenants want to be in the space, but also attracts an ecosystem of support for that those entrepreneurial activities. So it could be angel networks, venture capital firms, law firms, things like that just want to be around that activity. And that helps the whole thing succeed.
So then your project is dependent on the incubator space?
So the co-working space is a separately financed condominium within the project. That's the way that we're actually able to get that capital into that element of the project. And it stands alone from the rents from co-working occupants. So small businesses ranging from an independent individual freelancer to a 6 to 8 person company. That's really where the majority of the income comes from. It's not the incubator space that's supporting the financing per se, but it's the incubator space that helps give the entire space and the project its identity and really help attract those tenants.
So I guess for me, Madam Chair, it's looking forward. I mean, this was a new concept. Incubator lab space, not lab space, but incubator office space or co-working space was something new when we started talking about this. We hadn't had one here. Impact Hub was the first one, I think Church and State, and now we've got 3 or 4 that have come around, and Gateway's now opened another one for them there. So I guess for me, it's a policy question. At what point in time do we say, we're not going to fund this type of business that's already here when we have private industry that's already funding that? So it's just something for us to look forward on other projects. I'm not looking to change this, but I'm just talking as from a policy standpoint for us as a board.
Thank you, Ms.
Council. And then my follow-up question on this is that, on the second question is, since we've seen so many changes through this project already, with these changes that move forward, how do we know that you're not going to come back and ask for something else in addition to what's already been put on the table?
We are finally at the finish line. This is a project that I think it was obviously ambitious in scope, and certainly advanced in a challenging time in terms of construction costs and interest rate environment and the financing environment. And a lot of those challenges are the reasons for changes that we've had to make to get us to that point. But we, at this stage, are within weeks of being able to finalize the project and achieve a financial closing. We're actually pushing to do that by the end of the year. And once we've done that, the capital has been raised, the financial structure is in place, and we would not need to come back to make any further changes.
And at that point in time, what's your timeline for project build-out?
Building B is on a 18-month timeline, and Building A is on a 24-month timeline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Rogers. I took a note, and I'll keep notes, as I usually do, of questions or concerns when we get to the policy side of the conversation, but that one's the first one on the list. And as I am about to excuse you, this is a good segue. I think Councilmember Rogers' questions were good because I don't remember that being a part of the pro forma consideration that we saw. When you were talking about the restaurant incubator space, was that part of the financial pro forma that
It is, but it's
Will receive?
it's underwritten at a market retail rental rate, so that the project is not burdened by additional expense or risk related to the operation of a food hall. To take a conservative approach, we included what would be the market rate rent for that retail space in the project underwriting. So it is built into the pro forma, but as conventional retail space.
And does the shifting of that then transfer the risk to other pieces of the project?
Transfers the risk to us as the developer of the project.
I should note that one of the key,
I got to tell you that, so the piecing out of the seller's note from 1 to 3 pieces, as Melissa Jensen showed in her slides, happened fairly recently and seems to clearly separate revenue potential from the retail component, the commercial component phase from the other components, so that if there is a good cash flow happening on that piece of the property, which is the most likely to generate the revenue, then, and there isn't sufficient revenue happening at the housing components, we in the loan position are not in any way connected to the revenue that will be generated from that commercial and retail space. In other words, the developer isn't obliged to pay the city back on the housing components if they aren't producing the revenue, even if the third piece of that project is making plenty of money. And so I think that we will get into this with the administration more, but I think what Councilmember Rogers raised highlights that it would have been really helpful for us to receive a consolidated pro forma on this project from the developer instead of, I think, 9 pro formas that we received. That makes it so that Councilmember Rogers and us have to ask a lot of questions about how the financing works. We're working on the fly right now and have been actually as the information has changed and trickled in and actually not sufficiently come in, which is not your fault. So I hope you feel the sincerity that I think you're creating an exceptional project. It's something that's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to it happening here in our city. It's also in its in the pursuit of its creation highlighted a whole basket of questions for us as policymakers and the budget oversight for the city. So with that, if there aren't any more questions for the developers, we will let you go back to your seats and we can dig into the policy questions here. Anything else, council members? All right, Matt, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you. So council members, before we get into the staff report, Cindy Lou, could you help me? You know that I'm a visual thinker, and so I had to doodle a little bit, and then we tried to make it more legible, and Cindy Lou's gonna pull it up, but this is, oh geez, it looks pretty bad. Yeah. Actually, I didn't even draw that. Someone else redrew that for me, and it probably looks better than mine. Yeah, it looks better. My 2-year-old drew it. But what I tried to piece out is that the administration clearly feels that this is, on the one hand, not an exceptional use of any of these financing tools or incentives that the city has, and on the other hand, has said that this is a proof of concept, that we're doing something a little bit different here. And so in the agreement that this is a little bit different, I tried to articulate, oh gosh, it just looks worse the closer it gets, so yeah, there's a paper copy of it. But I tried to piece out the past uses of some of the selling tools that we're seeing at play here today, like the percentage rate and the repayment terms. So here we've got a 0%, 0%, and 1.1% that come up to 0.79%, 35-year term balloon payment. And as we've seen as council members, there are times when those balloon payments come up and it's a totally different council than when the loan was initiated and they come back and ask for forgiveness. So I think none of it's actually guaranteed, which is something we do all the time. The Housing Trust Fund wasn't a component of this, and so there's some advisory and oversight components that we're missing. In the past, we do use RDA loan tools, land write-downs, and seller financing. And my drawing, if you can imagine it, having some lines connecting some of those bubbles on the left-hand side. So we might see a project that has 2 of these tools or 3 of these tools in different ways. And the way that this project feels to me is that there's been a very creative combination of several incentives, and some of those are, like the percentage rate, are actually quite different. And part of that is I'm sorry for the crude drawing, but this is operating off of somewhat of a lack of clear information on the council office part, in not receiving a consolidated pro forma that we could have analyzed. It also has to do with, for me, the fact that there wasn't an analysis done on this, as we usually see with Housing Trust Fund or RDA loans, that it went to the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board and that they weren't able to issue opinions on it because there wasn't a presentation and it didn't come back to them. And also that the National Development Council that issued a letter of support, I had the chance to sit down with the gentleman who wrote that letter and ask if he was able to conduct an analysis. Did he see the pro formas? Was he able to do an analysis, or was this an endorsement of support for the efforts of HAND? And he made it very clear that it was the latter. It was not an analysis or technical by his opinion. And then additionally, the other piece of analysis that I can't see, even though Melissa Jensen, I appreciate you saying you're happy to talk through the details. I am not a financing expert. I can't sit up here and ask all of the intelligent questions that our advisory councils, our citizen advisory boards, the RAC, and others are equipped to ask. So it's no good to me now. And so all of this is to say that I don't know how, going forward, I can, as a policymaker and as a member of the budget oversight for this city, ask the right questions or assume that this combination is appropriate for public funding. I don't know. And I think even our skilled council staff people don't necessarily know because they don't have the information that they need. And so I've, in that list there, I articulated really obviously in a short manner some of the concerns, and I bring these up in an effort to be clear with the administration about where the discomfort is, where the future policy considerations are going to be stemming from, and in a hope that we can talk about council member concerns. I know my peers have a lot of questions also, and I want this to be transparent and not combative, but there are some real concerns here that make it such that I don't want to see another application come before us before we resolve these issues, even if they're in the pipeline, because then our backs are against the wall and we still don't have the tools. So with that, I think I'll open it up to Jennifer Bruno to introduce the staff report, if you don't mind, and then we can dialogue from there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in our analysis, we were focused on the sort of typical thing we do in council staff, which is to try and break it down to the facts of the project and the pure facts, and then the processes and policies that those facts can inform. And I think it was in our effort to get really extra clear on the facts as it was transmitted in the administration's transmittal, that then it resulted in a whole host of other questions, and we've talked about that. And I do appreciate the administration working through our questions, but I think they've illuminated the need to have a shared understanding of what we mean by seeing the pro forma. And in my mind, we have not seen a consolidated pro forma. We've seen the residential pro forma, and we've seen one piece of the commercial pro forma, but we've not seen a pro forma that talks about all of the cash coming into the project and all of the cash coming out of the project. And ultimately, that's what I would assume that the budget and policymakers would want to see in terms of, does this project support the investment? So that's just what we haven't seen. So
Madam Chair, if we have questions, are we good to jump in on that?
Do you mind, Jennifer?
I might not have the answers, but maybe someone does.
Yes, please do. I think we have a lot of questions, so we might as well work through it as we can.
Yeah, I guess mine is towards that missing pro forma data that we're looking for, and how does that equate? I mean, that, for me, that just brings up a red flag, whereas the properties are being disseminated into 3 instead of 1. And then you're looking at different parcels doing different things. What about the loan repayment of that? How do you say, okay, well, actually, this building, which has a lot of affordable micro units in it, is not making any money? How are we going to justify, because they're making so much money on the commercial aspect of it, how are we going to say, okay, they're going to make the payment on this part of the parcel, but not the one that they've eliminated? So for me, that's why all these parcels need to be one, so you can actually not pick and choose how you're going to repay this debt or the payment that's going to come each month. So I guess that would be my first question.
Sure.
I know it's a lot. It's not really a question. It's more of a red flag for me, and just...
I want to echo what Jennifer Bruno said at the beginning, which I think is an important piece, and that is the shared understanding of the expectations of materials provided and what that entails. When you say one combined pro forma, in my head, just to be clear about how I interpret that statement, is that would be A, B commercial, B residential, all in one. And what would be produced by that is a debt coverage ratio of X. So I'm trying to be thoughtful in how I answer this. So we did a lot of analyses, and when the deal came in, I want to be clear to the developer's benefit, they had always advocated for 3 separate transactions. And that was a deal point that was being negotiated. And the 0.79% interest rate is a blended rate across all 3 regardless. And so I don't want to say it's not one or the other. My point is, to do a collective pro forma would only help you if you were tying the cash flow from one project to the next, which is a material change for the developer, and not one that I believe they would be willing to alter.
Isn't that what we originally received?
It is.
It is.
The original transmittal referenced one property.
Right.
Yeah. So this was not disclosed to us, and in fact, is part of why we're having a difficult time with this. So I think the administration is aware that we have been asking for that combined pro forma, and that we have been expressing concern, and that we understood that it hasn't come to light since it's only come to light since the transmittal was sent to us. It wasn't being dealt with it wasn't in the resolution. It wasn't. The attorney's office is now drafting a new resolution that reflects it, or has already drafted. So this is news to us as staff, and that's why we're raising the issues.
And we appreciate that. And again, looking for that solution going forward to make sure that that policy and guideline is received.
I think part of our job in the council staff is we deal in numbers and in facts. And when the administration says we've done a lot of analysis or we've done our underwriting, that doesn't help us. We have to be able to follow it we need to have a transparent process where, if we look at the state programs or any of the other components of this, there's a transparent process, maybe not the private lending, but where you can see, here was the application, here was what was requested, here's what the situation is. That's not available to us. We've asked for a lot of things, we've received a lot of things, but we can't make the tie between all of the things. And I don't know that it's a good idea to continue the project. I mean, certainly it's a fabulous project, but it would help if you guys could examine whether it's absolutely essential to have 3 separate projects, since that is not what was initially presented. Can you speak to that?
Speaking to that, you just said that that administration's been pushing for 3 separate transactions all along.
The developer.
The developer.
Okay. Then why did we come to the point where you were done enough with your work that we received a transmittal with 1 transaction, which then changed after we received the transaction? I mean, the transmittal?
Blended interest.
Yeah, it references a blended interest rate, which in my mind, and I will fully admit that how I interpret things is not how it is, but a blended interest rate suggests that there is more than one interest rate.
And I think, from my perspective, there absolutely can be more than one interest rate for a variety of reasons, not simply relating to property. So that's what I was assuming, and it's not fair to assume, and that's why
We'll get clarity.
it would have been helpful to have that in the...
Work through
Yes,
clarity making.
yes.
But back to Councilmember Rogers' point and what you raised about consolidating those would consolidate the revenue and repayment into a single contract, essentially. And that is what we're asking about. So can you...
Sorry, can you repeat your specific question?
Yeah, you said that if we had one pro forma and if we had one project instead of 3 separate transactions happening here, 3 separate seller's notes, then the revenue from one piece of it would be tied to the repayment of any other piece of it. And I think that's the question that Councilmember Rogers raised and Cindy reiterated of, and that was the impression. Obviously there's some clarity to make going forward, but we believe we received a single project, and that was bifurcated into 3 projects, trifurcated. So how is that, I guess it sounds like there's just not a lot of information that we had.
Council staff, in an effort to recognize that changing the deal terms for the developer this late in the game might not be possible, threw out the idea, and maybe it's also a non-starter for the developer, that the contract be clear that the cash flow created by any property referenced in the resolution be available to service the seller note given to its affiliate regardless of property origin. So rather than trying to recombine the financial transaction, since it seems that train has already left the station, being clear that this is still public land and public funds that are being tied up, and trying to at least just get the public repaid for that. But I don't know if that's even a possibility, so.
Anything, Melissa?
In terms of tying the surplus cash from another project, or from a separate parcel?
In this project.
In this project, what I would say is that I think the financing that they have lined up through their primary financing letters, their equity investors, this would be considered a serious material change, and I don't believe the developers would be amenable to it. I am not the developer. We could most certainly have them discuss this deal point with you directly. It was my understanding when I had this conversation with them early on that the need for the separate transactions was that associated with their primary financing.
Madam Chair,
Councilmember Johnston, please.
associated with their primary private financing or the state, say Olin Walker, other financing?
No, like their Freddie Mac and their equity investors and all of the layers that are before us.
So their assumption on my part is that there are requirements on those lenders' parts about when they get repaid vis-a-vis the city, essentially.
And the different type of cash that they bring in.
So I'm going to say that that's a generalized statement, and if we were doing analysis, we would say we need the detail of that.
The documentation.
And we wouldn't accept that as an answer.
All right, council members, other questions? Jennifer, do you want to kind of help us through the staff report? Because there are many good questions in here, and I want to make sure that we have the chance to get through as many as we can.
Yeah, so the next question, if I'm just working my way through page 3, I believe we discussed a little bit that the incubator space to be used for something else. It sounds like that the incubator space, just from listening to the developer, we don't have any of the information written, but that's a sort of independently financed portion of their project and neither contributes new nor detracts from cash flow. I think, and I could be wrong, I think we may have to amend the public benefit analysis because the public benefit analysis cites the incubator as a drain on the cash flow. So I think we just need to get clarity with the administration just based on that information from the developer. Is the incubator a drain on the cash flow and therefore requires a public benefit, or does it stand on its own unrelated to the cash flow? So that's probably not for you guys to spend your time doing, but we'll have to do that before Tuesday because that's when you're scheduled to consider it. The broader policy discussion of 9% low-income housing tax credits. One of the pieces that we observed is that while the 4% credits are absolutely competitive and not nearly enough to service the need in the state, city resources are also limited and not enough to service the need in the city. And without any analysis showing that the increased use of city resources justify the decreased use of federal resources and how many units are generated for each, it's hard for us to determine that that's a better use of sort of leveraged resources or if it's just sort of shuffling the deck chairs a little bit. So that's just a note going forward that the council could ask the administration to conduct a more thorough analysis of other markets that are doing this and what kind of outcomes they're seeing with that kind of approach. Because as the city knows, the housing funds aren't unlimited, and we do have to think about the sort of revolving nature of the revolving loan fund.
Cindy Guss-Jensen?
Just for the record, I respect what David said at the beginning of this, and I look forward to working with the administration on the systems and the policy issues so that we can smooth those for the future. But I would like to correct the record that I do not agree with what David said about the 9% versus the 4%. I see the 9% as a viable option, and I see the 4% as something that requires greater investment on the part of the other entities, which is, in this case, the city.
And I think that there is a policy conversation that we should have that has been assumed in this case, but that this body needs to have around the 4% versus 9% and how our role may change depending on the outcome of that conversation. So council members, Councilmember Fowler, did you have your mic? Anybody? Please.
The other question we had is, and this gets to, oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry. The question you asked before, Council Chair Mendenhall, is whether or not there are other projects sort of similarly situated in the pipeline that are expecting this kind of city and RDA financing package, especially projects that have sort of utilized this 4% tax credit thing, because we also don't want to put projects in jeopardy. And often with these affordable housing projects, there's so many different funding sources that the timing tends to get tight towards the end, as we're witnessing. And so in the interest of planning ahead so that the council's not crunched later, if the council wanted to ask the administration what's in the pipeline.
Thank you. Currently, we have identified 7 different projects that are in competitive process for 9% currently. Some of them you're familiar with, 255 State, that's the Brinshaw State Street project. Spark, it's also an RDA funded, the overnighter, thank you. 426 Apartments for Step House. Escalante is resyndicating, rehabilitating. Capitol Homes Apartments, Book Cliffs Lodge, Diamond Rail, are the ones that we have slated now. Whether they all get awarded or what that looks like, we would anticipate some sort of ask. I can't speak to the RDA's position on land or land write-down on that, but I'm sure they'd be happy to come up and contemplate what sort of public subsidy those might be anticipating. I'm not sure.
I think that for me, in the interim, I recognize it takes time for us, and I think there's actually multiple ordinances that we're going to need to tune up as a result of this conversation. That the outside oversight, having an analysis done by a third party, whether it's a citizen advisory group or it's a paid contractor, is critical, because we have, as we identified in the RDA meeting, there's about 10 financing tools, and that the Housing Trust Fund itself doesn't have any underwriting rules, and so I don't feel like we're equipped to give the thoroughness of an analysis that is necessary for these kind of considerations. So in the meantime, maybe that's a tool that we can implement.
Madam Chair, if I may just comment, I appreciate that, recognizing, again, a good example of deciding together what that path looks like going forward. We've talked a little bit about the comparable with Violin Commons, and so the process that we followed with the analysis here and within the policy guidance and poly framework that currently exists is how we operated with the analysis of the exchange. And so again, just to say that I appreciate the opportunity that we're looking forward in where some of the learning or improvements may be looked at, and not focusing on that something that was done incorrectly here, right? Because we followed that framework that was already in place. And so I hear the conversation being one of fixing that or changing that framework. So thank you.
And I want to say that if you would like to go through and identify the differences, we're happy to. We've never been in a situation before where we couldn't get a pro forma. That's significant.
And I was just talking about the process. Thank you.
Councilmember Fowler, and then Councilmember Luke.
Thanks. So I guess this sort of relates back to the conversation we were having during our RDA board meeting. But before I kind of go down that path, I want to say that to the developers, I like the ingenuity and the creativity, and all of this is a good project. I think what we are all feeling from up here is a frustration that we're being asked to make a finding or have some sort of understanding that this is a public benefit such that public money should go forward without having an adequate public benefit analysis. And when we did have it, it was given to us less than a month ago with the ability to try with all of the other things that we're doing to try to get to it and have a sufficient amount of time to go over that. And so certainly it's important for me to let the developers know that this is I like the project. It's a good project. That as there's frustration from some of us up here, it's not that this isn't what our city is looking for and needing and wanting and excited about, and sort of this creativity to our homeless problem, or not having enough homes, actually. But the process has been frustrating, and now I think we are in an opportunity. We spent, again, as I mentioned in RDA, the council before me spent a couple of years probably digging into the finances and the processes behind the projects for the RDA, and I think we have an opportunity to do something similar with what we're doing in hand, of saying, what are the processes and what's happening here with that oversight, so that we can capitalize on the money that we have, so we can help make a dent in the fact that we don't have enough affordable homes in this city, and we need to move forward on that. So a lot of these questions that were brought up today are not necessarily specific to, in my opinion, specific to this particular project, but rather what is this process and this policy as we move forward and look at other projects? And it seems like there's a lot here. I just want to point out that in our staff report, they said, look at all of the highlighted things. Every page here is highlighted, and that just means we have maybe some work to do as a body together to move forward and really start to make some dents in this and understand what programs we have available, what tools we have available, and how these different groups can work together to really move forward with our housing market. So I wanted to say that to the developers and also to our staff for working really hard, and that I really hope we use this as an opportunity to move forward productively.
Absolutely, thank you.
Councilmember Luke?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I jump in, I will say that I'm supportive of the project. I'm supportive, and I'm not going to work to delay anything moving forward, but I'm not happy, I'm not comfortable, and I feel like I'm being backed into a position where I'm being backed into a corner and having to rely on the word of the administration staff rather than the standard process that we typically go on. This has nothing to do with whether or not we trust the administration staff or not. I think you guys are all fantastic. I think you do good work. But in the separation of powers that we have in the city, it is critical that both branches of government fully operate and operate independently from one another. And the reason that we do that is so that we can ensure that we can take as much gamble out of these developments and things moving forward as possible. There's always going to be some risk. Housing is risky. We understand that. But for us sitting here at this table to do our job, we need to have, our staff needs to have all of the data in front of us, in front of them, so that they can help us work through that. That is how this works. It's not that we don't trust you, it's not that we don't trust your staff, but we have to, that is the process that we need to move forward with. I think that this project has the potential, to the developer's point, of becoming one of those developments that can be a light that other cities around the state, and frankly, that Salt Lake City can look at and say, look, we're proving that we can do something that others have said that we can't do. I like that. I like the ingenuity, and I like that opportunity. But we need the data in order for that to move forward. So while I hope that we look at the project, and I hope that the project is as successful as we all hope that it will be, and that we can use that as an example moving forward, I don't want this process to be used as a formula on how we're going to be handling this stuff. And I think that, from what you've said, I think that, everyone acknowledges that there are things that, that can be done better, and that, we're all committed to doing that moving forward. So I'm not going to do anything to hold this project up. I don't fault the developers. I think the developers have been doing things as quickly and as on the fly as possible. I think the administration and all of your staffs have been doing the same thing. I think you're trying to figure out how to make this work and being creative and nimble and flexible. And as a council, we are nimble and flexible as well, but we have to have data. We have to have the information because if we don't, it puts us in a position where we're being accused of acting reckless. And that is not something that I take lightly. It's not something that that I agree with. And so, Madam Chair, what I'd like to do is, propose a straw poll that we look to. I'm just trying to think how to phrase it. That we put together a working group of council staff, council leadership, and anyone that the administration would like to put together so that we can figure out how not to do this again. Because it really is putting us in a bad spot. And so, I think that, as a council, I would hope that we're, willing to work through that. I believe, from the administration that you're also willing to do that. So that would be the straw poll that I'd like to put forward now, and that we have that group meet as quickly as possible, because as Melissa mentioned, there are a number of things in the pipeline right now, and I don't want to have this kind of a meeting again.
So we've got a straw poll from Charlie, and I'd like to friendly amend to just add that the work group address long-term and interim solutions to providing, to resolving the issues. Is that friendly enough? Discussion on the motion. Councilmember Johnston?
When you talk about long-term and interim, can you define a little bit? We're not talking about this particular proposal. What we define as interim, I guess.
Well,
No, my straw poll does not impact this proposal. I think we're too far along in this process, and like I said, I don't want to slow this down, but I don't want to replicate the process that was used to get us to where we are.
And I think there's multiple ordinances that we need to make amendments to. That takes time to do it right, and it's the time it takes while we're working through that, some
Sure.
interim
The question,
strategy.
though, what's the interim strategy as in the next 3 months? We need to start addressing things that are happening now, or?
Well, I'm saying, for example, having a third-party analysis, financial analysis of these, and that might be something that comes out of our audit funding, or I don't know where.
Okay.
Okay, any discussion on this motion? All those in favor? Got 6 up.
Okay.
And before I pass it to Councilmember Wharton, I want to mention, based on what Councilmember Fowler and Luke said, that it's just not sustainable for us. And I think part of getting an awesome project is that it's expensive, and that we are getting a unique piece of the housing need in the micro units out of this. But I don't believe that this is a sustainable model for us, and neither is the lack of information sharing. And the point of it being publicly subsidized is that the public has access to all your analysis and all the decision making that we are now being asked to allocate money toward, and we don't have that. The public doesn't have that. I believe it's there, but we're not sustainable on the information side. We're not sustainable, I think, on the model that we've cobbled together here. But I'll turn it over to Councilmember Wharton, then Councilmember Johnston.
So something that really stuck out for me from our last briefing was the lack of input from the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board, and we talked about how there was some disagreement about the semantics of the name and whether they were necessary for them to weigh in. I think we've talked among ourselves about expanding the authority and the role of that body to just being a housing advisory board in general. And I guess, I don't know if we need a straw poll for that, but in order to get that in the process, but I also would want to know if we have these things that are coming through and we're not able to amend the ordinance in time, I'm going to want to hear from what the Housing Advisory Board has to say. So I don't know if it's appropriate to poll that as well, but that's going to be a question that I'm going to keep having as these things come through the pipeline, even if we don't get the ordinance amended in time.
I think, Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would like you to propose a straw poll that in the interim, the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board review all applications until we have addressed these issues in ordinance.
Yes, thank you. That's what I was getting at. So I will propose that in the interim, until we're able to amend the ordinance, that we ask that the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board issue an opinion on all of the projects that we have that are going to come before they come before this body.
Discussion? Councilmember Johnston?
I'd just like to know what the effect would be if that's an expectation.
If I think we would just need, so maybe we have some questions in terms of what, just a little bit of clarity in terms of the intent of the motion. Obviously, RDA, I would imagine, doesn't involve the RDA component, because that goes through the RDA process, but
I guess, can you specify what types of application you're talking about? Multifamily development, land disposition, public benefit analysis,
Yeah, everything.
Yeah, all of it.
every,
Well, see, at this, we have RAC, but RAC didn't analyze all of the hand components of this project. And there was an RDA piece of this pie, but they didn't look at everything that's on the table today. So it's not, I can't say if the RDA is involved, we've got it taken care of, because they don't.
I'm just looking for clarification. We do a lot of mortgage applications for residential housing. Like, I just need some scope. Are you saying everything that comes into Hand's office, you want the Housing Trust Fund board, everything that's not federal dollars,
I think anything that you need city council approval might be a good standard.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
anything that eventually comes to Salt Lake City Council needs to go to an advisory board.
thank you for that
Thank you, Cindy. That's
clarification.
what I had envisioned.
Okay. Andrew, any
Well, I
discussion
know
on the
this is off the
motion?
top of your head, but potential negative consequences of this directive?
I actually don't know that there are any. Both of these transactions, I would say Violent Commons and the Exchange, are huge land parcels that are developed, and so I would imagine that the impact of doing that is very nominal. Most of what we would anticipate coming forward is Housing Trust Fund loans. The loans that we saw in the 9% tax credit competitive process, those would be funneled most likely through Housing Trust Fund. So I don't see an issue unless perhaps there's something that this body is thinking of that I'm not considering, and then I would be happy to.
Yeah, I'm not envisioning like the mortgage situation that you talked about, but you think of it from, I just ask you to consider it from our perspective, like things that are going to come before the council. My first question is going to be, well, among my first questions is going to be, what has been the recommendation of that board?
Sure.
So,
Okay, any other discussion on the motion? Everybody understand the motion on the table? All those in favor? That's 6 up. Thank you, Councilmember Wharton. Anything else?
no, thank you. Thanks for your work on this, and thanks to the developers for your work as well.
Councilmember Johnston.
I know we have a special session next week to deal with this, 18th, is that correct?
Yes,
And
at
that's a
noon.
deadline based on the tax credits or something else? Or the financing of some sort? What's the deadline based on?
Yeah, I mean, you can speak more specifically to the developers, if you want to ask more questions of the developers in terms of the timeline, but that was several months ago when we first approached council staff about a deadline, or things that we felt needed to get done by the end of the year, was based on the financing and what the developers were indicating the needs are in terms of, and you heard it today, in terms of finalizing the financing.
Is that for the 4% tax credit deadline, though? No. It's late for that, right?
Mostly related to interest rate risk. They want to put about $1 million up to secure an interest rate, and then you have like a 90-day deadline from that, as well as just timing risk of the project.
When does that end, do we know?
When does what end?
Their window?
I can't speak to that. That would have to be a question
Okay.
for the developer.
What is realistic to get for council staff before the 18th as far as the questions we have, the details of the pro formas, things that they feel we're missing? Are we clear on sort of what we feel we're missing and what could or couldn't be sort of delivered in that time frame for us?
Well, can I just say,
yeah.
it's becoming very clear that we don't have time to even make it through all of the questions. So I really like Councilmember Luke's work group suggestion, because there's no way we're going to get to all of this tonight.
And I think that in terms of your questions about the questions that we have about this project specifically, it sounds like the information is what it is, and I don't know what more we can.
What we do when we get to a situation like this, and we try to never get to a situation like this, in fact, I've only had a few in my career here at the city, is that we switch to just simply making disclosures for the public record. So all we're going to do from here on out is to try to list what we know, what we don't know, what the public should be aware of. That's all we can do at this point.
I think there are some fundamental disagreements in the approach, and maybe those disagreements came from not flagging the concerns early enough in the negotiation process with the developer. And so I think the primary concerns I'm seeing are things that are too late to negotiate with the developer.
Well, those are negotiation things, but is there information and specific data and things that we're missing that
Yes.
we wanted for the analysis that we can get in the next week?
Yes, but I think they go to the negotiation with the developer, and so I don't think they're.
Okay.
I don't think having those pieces of information would necessarily change the outcome at this point, unfortunately.
Okay.
So the fact that today is the first day that I have ever known that the part of the space was entirely removed from either the revenue or expenses or both. I didn't know that before today. I don't know that that was disclosed to Jennifer before today. We knew we couldn't get the information, but
yeah.
we didn't know that it was intentionally removed. So we either missed that, or whatever, but we didn't know that until today. Knowing that today, knowing more about that only matters if there is a strong desire on the part of the council to try to get the developer and the administration to agree to putting something in the contract that requires the revenue from all of the pieces to be considered in the repayment of the loan. So if that's the direction you want us to go in, we can, work on that with the administration, but other than that, it doesn't help us to get more information.
Is that the direction you're looking to go, council member?
Well, I have to vote on it next week. I'd like to know some of the specific rationales personally.
Okay.
As disclosing to the public or justifying the public or both are different things, but at the end of the day, I've got to vote. I have to stand up and say why I voted for it or not, and the details are probably going to matter for me, frankly. So if there's things that we haven't gotten, it'd be helpful for me personally to the justification about, well, for instance, I understand the need for more capital if you're going to 4% LIHTC. That is clear to me. The question is, what are the demands that were made about who gets paid first, repaid first in these situations? How did that come about? Why are we in the positions we are? Those kind of questions are interesting for me to understand that. And then the details about the things you just brought up earlier. I mean, there's a lot of questions about the spaces separating out into 3 different financing terms and why that happened exactly. I mean, those are the questions people are going to ask me, right? I may not know all the answers, but I needed some basic information that can help me sort of direct. Does that make sense?
Is that information you can get to us before next Tuesday?
Is your question about why we're in the,
Second to fourth positions, depending on
I can
what
speak
was
to that.
loan.
Well, in writing.
In writing.
We'd rather have it in writing so that we all get it and it's in writing for the public.
Okay, we will check it maybe in the memo that we provided in response to the initial questions, but we'll check.
Okay.
And if not, we will provide it in writing.
The explanation, just so you know, the memo that was provided, the explanation for the splitting into 3 properties was that the developer requested it.
Yeah,
That's not a public justification.
Right.
that's exactly
So-
the question. So like, are there
Right, so
details
that's-
about that
right.
that help me understand why it was beneficial in some capacity to split into 3 different properties? Because I saw that piece.
Right.
But the details, when someone asks me, well, why did they split into 3? I don't know. The developer did it, right? We just did our part in the financing piece, but those details kind of help me understand a little more about why I would vote to support it versus another project which may not do that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, other council questions? I do want us to move on soon. I'm going to go through our questions, okay? And I think that they're only what we were able to address in the dialogue tonight. There's much more to address in the work group.
Yeah, but Madam Chair, if the work group we'll go over all of these items in our staff report, right?
Right. Okay, so we've got Councilmember Johnston talking most recently about disclosure and justification, and I think by that you meant disclosure to the council and therefore the public around separation of the notes and some of the other financing decisions that seem to be initiated by the developer and accepted by the administration. We need the justification for that exception as it relates to public financing. Councilmember Chris Wharton did a straw poll that the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board will review all projects that would come to the City Council, regardless of whether or not they're Housing Trust Fund, except for RDA project, which will be reviewed by RAC. I asked around, I think this is more for the work group, that there be some analysis around the sustainability of these types of clustered financing packages. So sustainability is the question. Charlie Luke did a straw poll around a working group, council staff and council leadership working with the administration to address all of the questions that we've raised tonight and that are raised in the staff report. Councilmember Amy Fowler talked about getting clear around timeline and expectations for transmittals and information shared between the branches here. Councilmember Rogers brought up the question around, should we be subsidizing incubator space going forward? I think that's whether or not, we'll let the work group decide whether or not that's a piece of their analysis, or if that comes back to the council or the RDA, which it probably should for future discussions. We also talked about clarity of expectations. I already said that. Public benefit analysis, citing the incubator as a drain, and whether or not we need to clarify that public benefit analysis, that it is neither a cost nor a benefit, which I think raises a question about the public dollars supporting the project if that isn't a gap. And then that there, I mentioned that I'm not supportive of any future projects before we address these issues. Although I wrote that down before we got to the creation of the work group and the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board reviewing any projects in the pipeline. So I'll withdraw that last one. Okay, thank you, Ms. Jensen and Mr. Litvak and Ms. Bruno for being with us. It's a hard conversation, but it's a necessary one, and we'll get through it. We're going to move on to the second item on our agenda, the budget amendment number 2 for fiscal year 18-19 follow-up. And if I'm not mistaken, the only real conversation that we may or may not need to have remaining on this is if there's any conversation about the Eastside Police Precinct acquisition that the council members want to have. This could be a very short conversation also. Ben, will you kick us off?
This is the 4th briefing on the General Fund Budget Amendment number 2. The council held public hearings on November 13th and on November 27th. At the last meeting on December 4th, the council talked about using vacancy savings on 3 separate items and expressed support for all 3. That's reflected on the motion sheet for your potential action tonight. The council also requested that staff prepare a draft legislative intent about the donation fund, and I'm going to pull that up, and it's also on the second page of your staff report to review.
Ben, I'm distracted by the handout. Do you want to tell me not to look at the handout for a minute?
Let's go to the shiny handout. So the handout you have in front of you is a quick analysis that council staff put together. This is in response to council member questions related to the cost of a bond for an Eastside Police Precinct compared to the number of officers that could be hired for the same price over the same time period. What you'll see on the first column is the years, then you'll see the bond payments. These are taken from the amounts that the city's financial advisors, George K. Baum, provided and that were discussed at the last briefing. And this is the most expensive financing option, using a $20 million local building authority bond. The third column is the total annual cost per officer, using the estimates that we previously worked on last year when the council dove into adding additional officers. So we've used those costs, updated them for the current fiscal year, and then we've listed each of those costs in its own column further on the right, and they are added together in the total annual cost per officer. And I also want to point out on the very far right column are costs that are not included. So this is not comprehensive. There are certainly other costs, but this was the best that staff could put together on a short basis.
That's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you.
What the analysis concluded is that the Eastside Police Precinct would create operational efficiency savings equivalent to more officers compared to hiring officers under the same funding level.
Say it again.
The cost for the bond fine. So in addition to the handout, there's also an email that summarizes this information, which does include the conclusion.
Turn your microphone.
So to repeat, the conclusion is that the city could have 17.4 officers for the $1.5 million bond payment in 2023. So if you just look at that 1 year, you could pay $1.5 million on the bond, or you could have 17.5 officers. As you continue to look at years thereafter, the ratio of officers to the bond cost decreases because officers become more expensive as they gain experience and years of service in the city. The administration told the council in a previous transmittal that creating an Eastside Police Precinct would generate a 20 to 30% efficiency savings for 100 to 150 officers. That efficiency savings translates to 20 to 45 officers, which is certainly more than the 17.5 officers that the city could pay for in that first year of 2023. Now, we don't have a breakdown of how they reached that 20 to 30% to check the assumptions, and so the police are here and they could speak further to that point. But I hope that this information does get to the council's interest in looking at officers versus bond payments.
I think this is really helpful perspective on the values that we're trying to balance and weigh here in the conversation. I would love to invite, I see Chief Brown in the audience. Also, is it Sergeant? Captain Tierlink. I know nothing of what the ranks mean, so I apologize if I spoke below your level. Scott?
It's right there on that
How about
collar.
Scott? Is that okay? Chief, talk to us about the 20, I know you talked to us before about 20, 30%. It was kind of a, you drove around and checked the time it took to get from A to B, but tell us more about the analysis.
Yeah, we have looked at this for some years, and thank you for coming back. And Ben, thank you for that very detailed analysis. You've done a great job. I don't know
You
why
can't hire Ben, okay?
Okay.
That we won't fund it in your budget.
All right. So what we did is we have driven from the Pioneer Precinct. We have driven from the downtown PSB. And the main area that we've been looking at was always the Sugar House statue on 11th East there and 21st South. Different times of the day from different locations. I think it would range anywhere from 20, 25 minutes from the Pioneer Precinct to maybe 18, 20 minutes from downtown. So it varies, but it still was a substantial amount of time. And then Captain Tierlink has gone back, and Scott, maybe you explain a little bit of how you reached, because we talked about, we go to lineups, we go to line downs, we travel through the communities, we go to the beats that we patrol, but we're always commuting back and forth, and there are operational efficiencies. And so Scott's done some background work and some polling of officers about how many times they actually go to the precinct. So Scott, you want to explain that a little bit?
Yes, so I actually pulled the patrol captains, particularly the Liberty captain, since it would be mostly his area where this would be the operational efficiency would be. In talking with the officers, just polling, we determined that about 2 to 4 trips on a given shift So we already know that we start lineup at a police building, and then we drive to our area to patrol, and the officers are assigned their various areas. When they take a call, if it has anything to do with evidence, they need to go back and book that evidence. If it's a DUI, they need to go back and process that DUI. If they want to take lunch at the station, rather than in their car, they drive back to do that. So we just said, on average, how many times as a patrol officer are you driving back and forth between the buildings? And they said between 2 and 4 per shift. If we take that low end and just say they're going to make 2 trips back to the police station in a 10-hour shift, and then we add up the line up, the line down, and those 2 round trips, then that's 4 trips at 20 minutes each.
But that's assuming that they're going to the east side or coming from the east side.
Yes, and so that's
But
why...
that's not where the concentration of crime is when we look at the crime maps.
We were looking at that as just the Liberty officers. So if we take just the officers that are assigned to Liberty right now, we take 100 of those officers that are assigned to Liberty Patrol Division, that's their areas up in that area. So when they're on patrol, now when they take a call, it may be wherever they're responding to take the call. But whenever they book the evidence and then they go back out, they're responding to their area for that area of patrol.
Okay, thank you.
So with those 6 trips, if we just estimate that it's about 20 minutes per trip, the 6 trips would add up to 2 hours on a 10-hour shift. So that's 20% inefficiency of just commuting back and forth. Now, those are just rounding numbers. Again, some trips might be further up on the east side, some might be closer to the downtown area. We didn't take anything into account on where they were coming from on which particular calls. That would be too extensive for how short of a time. But in just pulling the officers of how many trips they're making back and forth, and knowing that that time could be spent patrolling the neighborhoods as opposed to just commuting back and forth, is just an operational efficiency. We already have really good locations for downtown. For the west side, we've got the Pioneer Precinct and the Evidence area that is further west. So we've got good proximity to anywhere that there's calls on the west side. But whenever we take calls on the east side, it is not a good proximity for them to commute back for that.
Thank you, Captain.
Yep.
And so what we did is we took, if 20% of their time on a 10-hour shift was spent in commute, that would be a 20% savings in time. We roughly took $150,000 per year. I mean, this is easy math. I mean, it may be less or more. And looked at that. The cost savings would be roughly 20 officers that we could put back into the field. And the biggest difference is we amortized the building and the cost over 50 years instead of Ben's graph here shows 21 years, and that's why there's a higher number. We said if you have a $25 million building and you amortize it over 50 years, it's $500,000 a year. So the comparison we made, $500,000 a year would be anywhere from 3, 4, maybe 5 on the best side of officers that you could hire.
Council members, do you have any questions on this efficiency savings analysis and the comparison of officers to bond payment? Councilmember Johnston?
Yeah, I thank you for this, Ben and Chief. And it's hard to sort of verify any of this. We know that. I appreciate the effort, though. It makes a big difference in trying to put something tangible in front of us to say, here's a balancing test between 2 options. So I appreciate the effort. I'd love to see as much of this as possible. It helps sort of frame it for me to bring in all the other less quantifiable pieces of this discussion and put some context to them. So I appreciate the work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Ben, we've addressed the other issues in this budget amendment. Are there any that you need to raise with us aside from this precinct?
Just the draft legislative intent for increasing the donation fund, as well as creating a process in resolution and/or amendment, ordinance amendment to codify that process moving forward, if the council is comfortable with the legislative intent for action tonight.
Yes, council members, you remember we discussed that at our last meeting on Budget Amendment 2? Do you need us to review the language right now?
If council members are comfortable reviewing it before the vote, that's sufficient.
Okay, great. I think that in looking at our action, we're set to take action on this budget amendment tonight. And if we proceed with approving the $3.57 million to facilitate the development of the East Side Police Precinct, and acknowledging that the administration is still in pursuit of a property, I wonder if we can hear from whether it's you, Chief, or someone else in the administration about when you anticipate coming back to the council with information such as the results of due diligence on any given property.
Is Mr. Reberg?
Thank you, Director Reberg.
Council members, good evening. Right now, excuse me, with this budget amendment, we will proceed in rapid search for the appropriate property. We've talked about one parcel already in closed session, some unique qualities to that. With your approval tonight, we will engage further on that piece of property and those conversations there. There is some unique issues associated with that we would probably come back to you very quickly with to talk about, because I think there would be unusual terms associated with a purchase agreement with that, just because of the nature of that parcel and what we would have to do in that. So if we pursued that and that made sense, we'd come back pretty soon and talk to you about the uniqueness of that deal.
We appreciate that, and we'll accommodate any request for that meeting and update, as we know that the cost of such a precinct will be much more than this $3.5 million that we are set to set aside tonight. And that, of course, the council will be involved in that financing. So we look forward to learning more as you go down the path, assuming that we pass this budget amendment tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council.
Thank you for being with us.
Appreciate
and thank you, Ben, also for your analysis. Any other questions, council members, on this budget amendment before we put it to rest? As I said, we're set to take action tonight. This brings us to our grant applications briefing. And oh my gosh, we're right on time. That's amazing. We've got 45 minutes to go through these. There's some pretty interesting things. And we should have Sylvia Richards from council office. Thanks for being with us, Sylvia. Ben Ludke. And then I know that we have a number of people from different areas in the city: Becca Rolfe, Tom Miller, Julian Sabula, Louis Kogan, and David Litvak. Sylvia, please.
If I may, I'd like to just identify a couple of points and bring them to your attention. First, some of the grants are proposing to use the county-imposed sales tax funding, while some of the Salt Lake City sales tax is proposed to be used for some of the grant matches. Second, 3 of the grants are proposing to use up to $120,000 for studies rather than actual street projects. Third, the 9-line application proposes a $300,000 match for the city sales tax funding and is for infrastructure improvements and amenities and not studies. Fourth, the administration's proposal for use of the city sales tax funds may have evolved and be different from the council's earlier budget discussions about the use of those funds. And the administration has some information to share and update the council on some of these items, and so they're prepared to answer any of your questions. Lastly, this round of grants is a one-time unique opportunity. Beginning in fiscal year 20, the county quarter-cent sales tax increase will be distributed 0.10% to cities, 0.10% to UTA, and then 0.05 to the county. So with that, I think it would be easiest to address the transportation grants, and also the administration has a PowerPoint. So if we do the transportation grants first, it would be addressing numbers 1, 2, and 3, and then 5, 6, and 7. So if that helps you organize your thoughts.
Okay.
Turn it over to the administration to go through the grants.
And I'm assuming, or that maybe Becca will be hearing from you also on 9 line. But I wonder, before we get into each of the project applications, if you could just tell me about these one-pagers that we have. Obviously, they're very, very brief. Is this what was submitted to the county or to the entity that's reviewing the applications, or was this created for us?
And are you referring to the presentation or to
Those, the
Okay.
grant application submission notification memos.
I am making my best guess. I think this comes from finance. When grant applications are submitted, everything goes through them, and then whoever the point of contact is prepares a memo for each grant application that's submitted.
And so does it remain in City Hall, or is this a piece of the submission to the funding entity?
That is a question I'm not sure of the answer to.
Okay. I just have to channel Lisa Adams for a moment and say, there are so many typos in these documents that I was like, oh my gosh, I hope this didn't go to
These are not the applications that were submitted to the county. Those were far more lengthy and detailed.
And edited.
And yes, and hopefully much better edited.
Hope so.
Yes. There were reviews that happened with those. So
Okay.
yeah, this is not representative of the actual application.
Okay.
Thank you, Jen.
Good to know. Thank you, Jennifer McGrath. All right. Who would like to start us off with number 1, the 9-line application?
Maybe, can I just give a little bit of an intro about the fund itself?
Yes, please.
So these funds, as you may all be aware, but I'll articulate it just to make sure everyone knows, is part of the Salt Lake County fourth quarter sales tax fund. So separate from the Salt Lake City sales tax, there's also the county sales tax, the fourth quarter, or the last piece of a penny. And these funds will ultimately have the distribution that was previously described. This first year is a little different, and it does stay entirely with the county. The initial intent of Salt Lake County was to spend all of that funding for this year on paying down debt. And they changed their mind, and so we suddenly learned that there were grant opportunities, and the fund is much larger coming through them this year than it will be in the future. So that's just basic context. Our intent was to look at places that we had already identified to spend funds, and to maximize those funds just by leveraging this opportunity. What has sometimes happened in the past is that we'll have projects we know we want to do, they get funded, and then we do the planning kind of afterward and have to match the planning to the funding. We're hoping to avoid that in this instance because we do have a lot of projects in the queue. So I hope that provides just a basic context.
Thank you, Julianne. And I think as you go through them, some of them there were required matches, some of them are points given if, as you're alluding to, if there is an optional match offered. And some of them talk about the sales tax dollars around our curb to curb, our streets infrastructure that we've committed. And so as you go through, I think we want to know, part of what we want to know is, where did this project line up in the document that the public has around, you know, that point in time analysis of the condition of the roads, which we understand is fluid always. And does the opportunity of this funding shift it somehow in that stack of what is to be done? And you can, I'd kind of appreciate if you do them one at a time, but if, Jennifer, if you want to.
I hope this will provide additional clarity. So for the Salt Lake County Transportation Choice Funds, there was actually no match required for eligibility to receive grant funds. They required identification of quote-unquote match dollars to receive points in a certain section if you wanted to do that. But if you did not have match dollars, you could still be eligible for those grant funds. So that's one point of clarification. The second point of clarification is that in every one of these circumstances, what we did was we looked at where were we already going to spend sales tax dollars and how could we just identify those funds in that area so that we could get the points, so that our application would be more competitive. What we did not do is shift sales tax dollars from something that it wasn't going to go towards to this as match. I know that that gets confusing because they use the term match and it's written in the application. What we were doing is leveraging dollars that would already be spent. So I'll give you an example.
Wait, I need you to, I want you to orient you to, even if we just go to the 9-line application. So there's the box that says match or leveraging funds.
Yes.
And like on this one, there is $1.8 million there, but the box isn't checked, which makes me think there wasn't a match required. And then I go to the next application for Life on State, that box is checked, and there's money there also. So
Yes,
help me understand.
I will explain. And this is just, so as Julianne explained, we got notification of this grant opportunity kind of at the last minute, and it was a very short burn. And so what we did was we sort of did a divide and conquer approach in terms of assigning different people to work on certain grants. And so the way that we described those dollars in those different applications was different depending on who was doing that grant application. So using the term match versus leverage just had more to do with the person who was filling it out than anything else, because the county used the term match. And again, the match was not required to be eligible for any of the county dollars. It was required to receive points in a certain section, but it was not a requirement to receive funds. So while we checked that box because we did have funds identified that were going to be spent in that area to count as match, we didn't reallocate money. So it might be helpful if I give an example. So 21st South, we'll be doing bus stop improvements. That's one thing we're going to do. We'll spend far more than $40,000 on that. We're going to be doing first last mile improvements. We'll spend far more than $40,000 on that. We'll be doing planning and design work. We'll be spending far more than $40,000 on that. But what we did is say, what do we need to identify in order to get the points that we know we're already going to be spending there so that we can get the points and be more competitive? So that $40,000 is $40,000. That's just a small portion of what we'll be spending on 21st as part of the sales tax allocation, which we already identified through that funding process. But it allowed us to get more points to make the application more competitive, which we hope will result in an award of what we think is going to be around $940,000 for money that we were spending in that area anyway. So I hope that that's helpful in clarifying. I realize that we've made a mistake with our language and we weren't consistent about the way that we did that. And all I can say is we were working really quickly to get those in, and we just weren't consistent in our language on some of that.
Okay, thanks. Julianne, when are the decisions going to be made about the funding?
They're anticipated at the end of this week, I believe, but it could push, right?
It could happen today. It could have actually already happened while we were sitting in this room. So those recommendations went to the county council today, and they had an opportunity to vote on it or not. I'm not sure what has happened. I'll check on that when we leave here.
Yes, please. That'd be great
I can tell you this. We did quite well. Many of our applications scored very high. 5 of them were recommended for funding. The one you care about is one of them. It was actually the Salt Lake, Mill Creek, South Salt Lake Holiday project was actually called out in the meeting that I went to at the county as an application that exemplified what the county was trying to accomplish in terms of regional significance and partnerships and all those things. And I think the benefit of that for us is that not only were we able to leverage the $40,000 that we were already going to spend in that area, But we also are going to save ourselves several $100,000 in planning work for bond projects because now those county funds are covering that. So we've turned that $40,000 into $940,000, most of which is going to work that is very specific to Salt Lake City that we need. And we're saving bond money because now the county is paying for work that we would have otherwise had to do to prep for those projects. So in particular, we should be very proud of that application as well as all of the others, but this is what we're supposed to do. What we're charged with doing is stretching our local dollars as far as we possibly can, and whenever we can, leveraging regional dollars to help us do that. And we were very successful in this effort so far, and so we are, fingers crossed, that the council approves those recommendations.
Well, if while you're sitting in the audience, you have time to look up the county council right now, it'd be great to know. But let's keep some time for our presenters to talk about the projects.
Okay, so with that, let's go to Tom to talk about the 9-line.
Is this on? Okay. My name is Tom Millar. I'm a transportation planner with the Transportation Division and the project manager for the overall 9-line trail, which is envisioned as a trail that connects east and west parts of Salt Lake City. It'll be about 8 or 9 miles long and stretches from the Surplus Canal all the way to Emigration Canyon. And the alignment is roughly where you find the existing 9-line trail right now, around 8th or 9th South, depending on what east or west you're at. There are several existing sections of the 9-line, and there are several funded sections of the 9-line. The parts that exist right now are Redwood to 7th West, and it terminates or begins at the 9-line bike park under I-15. Then there's a fairly large gap until you get to the 9th and 9th area. From the 9th and 9th area to 13th East is a project that the Transportation and Engineering divisions are doing next year. And that construction project, similar to what Jen said, takes the money that we were already going to spend reconstructing 900 South and does more with it. It implements the 9-line as we're rebuilding the street rather than as an afterthought. There's also an existing section between Guardsman Way and Airpine, known as the Sunnyside Trail, and then another funded section from Airpine to the western entrance of This Is the Place Heritage Park. So as you can tell, there are a lot of existing sections, and there are also a lot of sections that are going to be built in the very near future. One of the principal gaps in perhaps the most densely populated section of the 9-line is the section of the 9-line that we applied for funding to the county, and that is between 6th West and Lincoln Street, excluding the 2 Central 9th blocks that have already been funded for those Central 9th streetscape improvements. And because the capital funding was already available for those improvements, we did not include them in the funding ask. So the amount of money that came together and the amount requested wasn't just pulled out of a hat. It came out of the 9-line trail extension study that the city has been working on for several years. And luckily, the cost estimates included a nice section west of the Central 9th area and a nice section east of the Central 9th area. So we really didn't have to do too much math other than to say that to put in a new construction year, because the construction year in the plan or the study itself was 2018. So we assumed a conservative 2021 construction year, assuming it'll take some time to plan, or sorry, to design that facility. And that's where we came up with that money. You'll see on the slide, on the television on the top right, and this goes to the question earlier about match versus leveraged funds. So we estimated a total of about $7.1 million to build the entire thing, both the 9-line and the proposed reconstruction of 900 South through the grant. And so what we told the grant funders was that Salt Lake City is already planning to spend a couple $1 million on rebuilding this road, and also a couple $100,000 on transit improvements. And what we want to do is get all of those funds together and do them as efficiently as we possibly can, and be able to implement the 9 line, the transit improvements for the new 9 route, and improve pavement conditions for 900 South itself. I believe that this was the funding application, if I can say this, that I was most excited about, because
Me too.
Okay, good. Because it is just such a critical gap in the 9 line. If we are to build the sections that are funded, it'll still remain as this critical, somewhat downtown located section. And so I think that this is a huge opportunity for us to do good by our word in saying that we were going to improve conditions through the bond and the sales tax, and also, pardon me, implement the study that's had a lot of public support and a lot of process going into it as well.
Cool. Any questions on 9 line, folks? Actually, I think I did have
For
one.
context, I just want to add that this was discussed in CIP this year, and the total cost to implement the 9 line was estimated at $21 million for the full extension. So this would be a significant down payment on completing the grand project.
And when the memo that we have talks about elevating the streetscape, are you talking about a altitude elevation or a experience and atmosphere
An
elevation?
experience and atmosphere,
Just
yes.
checking.
Yeah, we're not planning on building any
High lines?
bridges or high lines or
There's a really nice
tunnels with
off-ramp
tailwinds
right
blowing in
there.
them.
Never mind. We're getting a bridge. We do need, okay. That's another story.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Number 2.
This one is Folsom. We switched up the order a little bit just so we wouldn't have to keep swapping people talking.
Okay,
if
so
that's-
in our packet, that's the 3rd one down, folks.
Folsom Trail. Great. The Folsom Trail, as you may be familiar, was funded through UTA's Tiger Grant, and it has a lot of cost efficiencies in designing and building the project all under one contract that's administered by the Utah Transit Authority. The amount that's allocated in the Tiger Grant to the Folsom Trail is enough to get us some street crossings, to get us the asphalt ribbon of trail, and perhaps to get us some minor improvements to the aesthetics along the trail. We saw this as an opportunity, again, to say that we were already working in the area, that we already have funding to do a lot of the work, and that we were requesting additional funds, not only to make the trail more aesthetically pleasing, but also make those street crossings safer. So really all this application does is asks for additional money to improve what we are already planning on building through that Tiger Grant.
Council members, do you want to start ranking your favorite projects? Just kidding. We'll see how they stacked up. All right.
Thank you.
Where do you want to go next? Oh, to number 2.
Okay, so Life on State. Life on State is one that is not sales tax related. I should just mention up front. It is a project that we just recently completed. In fact, there's still a project website, lifeonstate.com, that describes the study that we just did. It was an implementation plan, or I guess implementation study for the corridor. We got pretty detailed on a land use toolkit, and then we've since done some additional analytical work on the transportation components of it. It's pretty complex from a transportation standpoint, in part because it's a state-owned facility, but it's within Salt Lake City boundaries. This project specifically is a combination of study funds, additional study funds. There were certain items we identified as needing further study, and this primarily relates to parallel corridors, as well as construction funding of a couple of catalytic sites. Within Salt Lake City, this is roughly around the Sears site. So from about 600 to 800 south is what we are looking at. And we have a very concept level design, but essentially it really focuses on the goal of pedestrian safety, pedestrian first, making it an environment that's safe, but that also generates some economic vitality and a sense of security. Having people around is also a good thing from that perspective. And we'll look at some of the connections to State Street from within these study areas. You can kind of see these lines on the map. Full study area, and we're in partnership with South Salt Lake on this particular project as we were on the implementation study. So you can see on the map the study area. The photo that you see just shows a before and after rendering of what it would look like potentially after the improvements at the catalytic site area that's within Salt Lake City. The South Salt Lake, just for informational purposes, is about 2100 south to streetcar line.
Can I ask how much there is in the Complete Streets Enhancement Fund that the 230,000 would be coming from?
I believe there's 250,000 total. I'd have to.
My recollection is the same.
Okay. Great, thank you. Any questions on Life on State, folks? Great, where do you want to go next, Julianne?
This one is also me. For the West Side Multimodal Hub, and this one is something that we've talked about as we've developed the FTN, the plans for the FTN corridors, in particular the new 9 route that we'll be implementing in August of next year. One of the things that we identified in looking at these routes and switching things around, making them more direct, making them more frequent, is the need for some layover space. There are a whole bunch of levels at which you can provide layover space, from just a place to pull over on the side of the street and even a temporary restroom facility to something far more substantial, like the underground facility in Denver. And so there's a whole range of things that you can do. We anticipate doing something that's phased over time and takes into account that this is really a whole station area. It's right in the vicinity of a big RDA project that's forthcoming. And so what we want is for this to really be a place on the west side, in addition to just serving the needs of transit operations. And so in our conversations about what this should look like from the what do we need to do in 2019 for transit to function well, we also want to say what's the ultimate condition that we want here, and let's figure out how to build and phase toward that. So that's what this project envisions. The funding that is identified here, again, is noted as leverage funds. We know we have to spend at least a small amount, if on nothing else, a porta potty for this area. So hopefully we can do something better than that. But this gets us in place just to be able to do the transit improvements that we have planned.
Thank you. We do own some toilets on a cart. Oh, that this council bought once upon a time. We hope to avoid that option.
Yeah. Okay, next we're going to go to Becca to talk about the Greater Mill Creek Sugar House Circulation Plan.
Okay, I'm Becca Rolfe, and I'm with the Salt Lake City Transportation Division as the Active Transportation Planner. And there are 2 applications that I am presenting on tonight. One is the Greater Mill Creek Sugar House Circulation Plan. That is essentially an update of the 2013 Sugar House Circulation Plan that was done by the city, but this incorporates our neighbors. And so we have them in alphabetical order, in order to be fair: Holiday, Mill Creek, and South Salt Lake. If you look at the map, you can see I've kind of provided a red circle around their town centers. And notably, the new designated town center of Mill Creek is only about a mile south of Sugar House. So living in this area myself, I find that often my weekend errands consist of going back and forth between those 2 sections of town. And so we want to look at how that transportation system functions for everyone who's making those types of connections. And then the city center of South Salt Lake is only a couple miles to the west. And the designated town center in Holiday is just a few miles to the south. So looking at those all together as a system, while focusing on the key corridors within Salt Lake City that we are planning to reconstruct as part of the bond funds or as part of other funding sources, such as a recently awarded Wasatch Front Regional Council Surface Transportation Plan grant for 13th East. So this would take a look at transportation broadly, looking at alternatives for transit, as well as the details of how the Mill Creek, the Mill Creek Trail and the McClellan Trail might make connections to. You can see that there's a couple green lines indicating the McClellan Trail and the Mill Creek Trail. The total project is anticipated to be $1 million, with Salt Lake City proposing to put forth $40,000 toward the match points from the sales tax transit improvements. Do you want to do questions on this one?
Well, it sounds like the type of a project that could maybe work for CMAQ application too, but there's other people in the room who know a lot more about.
Well, we have also applied through Wasatch Front Regional Council for the TLC program, the, help me out, Julianne.
Transportation Land Use Connection.
Yes, thank you. So we have applied for that. This funding source through the county was $40 million in total. And so we applied for, I think it's $170,000 through the WFRC funds because that doesn't have as much funding in it total. So we couldn't apply for this large of a project from that funding source because they just don't have that as much funding.
Thank you.
Another important component I wanted to point out, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, we will be doing a lot of work on street design, specifically on the streets that we are going to be reconstructing as part of the bond list. And again, this is a way for us to get that planning and design work done and paid for essentially with county dollars rather than having to use Salt Lake City dollars or bond funds to do that. And that's about $450,000 of this total cost is to do that work. And so it's just another really important example, I think, of how we're able to leverage these county funds to help us get the work done that we already need to get done anyway and save us from having to spend other dollars that we can now allocate to other projects.
Councilmember Luke.
Yes, thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't mention on this map that we have in front that the Mill Creek Town Center that you have circled includes a substantial part of Salt Lake City.
Absolutely, and that's why it's important to us.
Yes.
We know it's an important connection specifically for Councilmember Fowler.
I just wanted to state that for the record.
And our city line goes to 30th and 33rd.
The problem, though, is that this map shows that the city center of Mill Creek is in
Salt Lake
taking
City.
over part of my district. So that's a problem. Yes, it's exciting that we will have a train or whatever. You know, I'm joking. We may be getting public transportation within Sugar House. It's concerning that a document we've put together, and I would like to know where that particular circle information came from. This has nothing to do with the grant or the project. It has to do with the circle.
The circle has to do with putting together a presentation very quickly for the council and using the basic oval tool available in PowerPoint.
It comes at bad political timing.
Yeah, it's not. This has nothing to do with you all. It's just for any Salt Lake City document. I think we need to be very clear that there are boundary issues that are
being pursued.
Thank you.
I will mention we used for each partner organization that participates in these and is contributing funding, we use how they define their area with the idea that if we don't see it the same way, this is a great opportunity to talk further and get that clarified. It is challenging when you don't necessarily agree and you're trying to come up with what is the best thing to show. They show this on their website, Mill Creek, City of Mill Creek does.
Well, and Mill Creek can show whatever they want to show on their website. Salt Lake City needs to be very clear on our website and any document that we put forward because the issues are real, and I understand that, that we want to get this done, and for, transportation, again, this has nothing to do with this project. We just need to be very, very careful, because going into the legislative session, there are already rumors that there is going to be legislation that will adjust the boundaries for us. So I would hate to have any city documentation used to justify that action.
Councilmember Fowler.
Thank you. If I can just expand on that, I appreciate the collaboration between all of these different cities. I think it's important that we do have collaboration, and I think, as you mentioned, Jennifer, it's one of the reasons that the county is probably considering funding almost $1 million for a project that, because of this collaboration, and I do appreciate that. I think, to Charlie's point and to my own concern, is that then a document like this may appear that we're acquiescing. And I certainly am not acquiescing to a boundary change that would eliminate a large portion of tax base for the city and my district. So I think that's the concern with a document such as this. Certainly not, again, the collaboration, the project itself, I'm excited about, but I think you can see where our concern may be.
Touched a nerve. I want to let Cindy Guest Jensen talk, and then I want us to move on.
Okay, just one quick thing, and that is that it isn't based on the perception of Mill Creek or the perception of Salt Lake City. It's based on the legal boundaries of Salt Lake City and the legal boundaries of Mill Creek. So whatever documents you do, please have them reflect the legal boundaries.
Okay, let's move on.
Thank you.
And thank you, Councilmembers Fowler and Luke, for raising the flag,
And just
which is the Salt Lake City flag with clearly defined boundaries. Even if we don't really like the flag, it's still our flag.
Soon to be improved.
So the map is submitted with the proposal, did not include the red circles, for everyone's
good to know.
reassurance. It
Now you can
included,
destroy
I put those on the map in order to assist with showing a PowerPoint presentation that you'd never seen before, and just to pull out those, to make those city centers pop for you. So I apologize. I'm sensitive to the discussion.
We're going to move on.
Moving on to Second South, which also features an oval circle, which does not propose to expand the boundaries of the street Second South. We have submitted a funding application to, again, do a study, planning, design, preliminary engineering, and to develop some architectural concepts for 200 South as a transit-focused corridor, and including a downtown transit hub. It's a $400,000 project, the design of which is to be determined, as it is indeed a planning and design project, but we've provided a couple illustrations of what other cities have done. One example is from Seattle, and that shows some bus islands where bus boarding occurs, and then bike lanes tucked behind the bus islands. The other example that's provided is a in-street transit center, and that was constructed in Burlington, Vermont. And so tucked into their narrow little New England street, they found space to have a place that you can have a bus station, an indoor place to wait, heated, and buses pull up on both sides, and it really serves as a downtown transit hub for them. This is, again, prior to the street reconstruction of 200 South. And so this is an opportunity to figure out in advance of that street reconstruction how we might refocus 200 South as a transit street. Again, we have proposed to use $400,000 of Salt Lake City sales tax transit improvements. I'm sorry, $40,000 as leveraged funds for that project.
Any questions, council members, on the Second South Transit Corridor project? Great.
I think this one is for Lewis, if we would like to move on to this one.
Mr. Kogan, thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you, council members, Madam Chair. All right. This ZooToYou Active Transportation Project was also submitted to the Salt Lake County Transportation Choice Fund. And I want to point out, I believe you have in your packets a slightly different number for the request amount. We made a last-minute reduction as we were budgeting for this project. So I believe your packets say 1.95 million. We ended up requesting about 1.55 million. This project looks to make some substantial improvements to the Bonneville Shoreline Trail. We say zoo to you, really between Emigration Canyon and Popperton Park or Dry Creek. This is based on the trail counts that we've done. This is the most heavily used section of the Bonneville Shoreline Trail in Salt Lake City. The Emigration Canyon unofficial trailhead alone frequently sees more than 400 trail users a day. And we haven't done enough research to know exactly how many are headed for the Foothills Trail System and how many are using the Bonneville Shoreline Trail as commuter access. But we know that there's substantial numbers of both folks. So what we were hoping to do with this project is make use of the substantial amount of funding available from the county and to some extent sell improvements to the section of the Bonneville Shoreline Trail as an active transportation project, helping commuters while at the same time helping recreation users. We were looking at some pretty costly improvements to formalize the trailhead at the mouth of Emigration Canyon. And also looking at some trail grade and erosion issues along the entire length of the BST there between Emigration Canyon and Popperton Park. Also looking at comprehensive wayfinding signage along this section of trail, and included in that trying to address the trail parking issues on campus by trying to improve ease of connection between public transit, especially bus and tracks, with the trail corridor by helping highlight how people could navigate between the trail system and those transportation amenities. So let's see, this project, our proposal, like Jen was talking about earlier, we were looking at what existing funds do we have and what can we say is already essentially we plan to spend and that will have benefits that accrue to this project. The City Council recently approved $396,000 for improvements to the Central Foothills recreational trail system. And so in looking at that, we felt like about $125,000 of that was near enough or associated with this section of the trail, Popperton Park, Dry Creek, the BST, and Mount Van Cott, and so we listed that as match. Our annual O&M costs anticipated here, should this be funded and constructed, primarily related to the trailhead improvements that we would see at the mouth of Emigration Canyon, and those were estimated at slightly less than $10,000 a year, so not too substantial. I think that's a good synopsis. Any questions?
Louis, can I ask you, and I apologize if I missed this part, how this fits into the phases of the Foothill Trail Development Plan?
Absolutely, and I apologize. I know that the council is eager to get an update on that plan, and I'm eager to give that. So we are still in the kind of the process of finalizing how we intend to go about phasing that plan, and part of that depends on how successful we are this winter and spring, doing some additional fundraising from 2 or 3 different grant funding sources. We're also working as quickly as we can to solidify partnership agreements with the other landowning jurisdictions across the foothills, being the Forest Service, the state of Utah, and the University of Utah. And so because that's still a little bit in flux, we initially were thinking that we would have to limit our first phase of trail improvements to only Salt Lake City property, but it looks like that probably will not be the case, and we can look a little more broadly and put more focus on those trail segments that were, very important to the most people. So
Great. Good news. We'll look forward to a bigger update
thanks.
at another time. Councilmember Wharton?
Just quickly, you mentioned Mount Van Cott, but that's not in that's later, right? Or is that in this section?
That's right. So there's kind of a spaghetti bowl of trails that it is considered the BST on the south slopes, or on the kind of lower slopes of Mount Van Cott, and something that we wanted to do as part of this project is clean that up and make it very clear what is the main BST, what commuters should be using. But part of cleaning up the trails on Van Cott also is associated with our larger Foothill Trail System plan.
Right. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. Thanks.
Anything else, Julianne?
Yes.
We have about 3 minutes. Can we
This
do
one is
in
not
3 minutes?
transportations, but it is another grant application that I think was on the list, the boat access grants.
Council members, are you seeing it? Oh. Go ahead, since we're short on time, whoever.
Okay, I
says
will try to be very quick. Earlier this year, the city's Trails and Natural Lands Division applied for funding through the Utah Outdoor Recreation Grants through the Governor's Office for the creation of kind of formalized canoe and kayak water trail on the Jordan River in Salt Lake City. We were successful in pulling in $114,000, and we're planning to utilize that money primarily to create new formal canoe and kayak access points adjacent to the Fisher Mansion on 200 South, and at 18th North on the Jordan River, just off of Redwood Road, where there's an existing parking lot for the Jordan River Parkway Trail. So we followed that up by submitting another grant to the Utah Boater Access Fund, and requested just less than $200,000 in additional funding, basically to just make those access points better.
And when will you know about that grant application?
Probably a couple of months.
We'll keep our fingers crossed the whole time, but let us know.
Thank you.
Any update from the county council folks in the audience? Anybody? Okay, all right. It's too much to ask. We'll just
Send an email to council
Thank
staff
you.
as soon as I know.
Fantastic. And we can actually hold our breath on that one because it's so imminent, the information. Just kidding. Well, these are exciting projects. We hope to have some of this new county transportation dollars. And we understand that as time goes on, that pool of funding will remain restocked from the new fourth quarter edition. So if we don't get it this time, we can look forward to future applications, I hope. Thank you all for being with us to help us understand these projects better, and we'll look forward to the updates. Thank you. Sylvia.
Madam Chair, David Litvak is here, and he was going to help answer questions on the HRC Cities Mitigation Grant. Did you want to?
That would be wonderful. I saw that application.
That's
but
number
it was
8 in
blank in our packet.
Was blank in your packet. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, David Litvak, that would be great to have you come up. Yeah, and I don't know about my peers. In my online packet, I have the Homeless Shelter Cities Mitigation Grant application from Utah Department of Workforce Services, but it does not have any information on it.
Great.
So it could have been a technical, apparently Chris has some. My staff report doesn't.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll be brief and quick. Last year during the legislative session, Senator Davis ran legislation that created a mechanism whereby the state collects funding from all cities that do not host a qualifying shelter, which is defined by statute. That funding is collected by the state and goes into a city's mitigation fund. 60% of the funding that is collected statutorily goes to South Salt Lake and Midvale for public safety needs associated with their resource centers. 40% then is competitive bid process, grant process for qualifying cities, of which Salt Lake City is one of them. I believe there's 5. And public safety, Department of Public Safety is also eligible. For that grant, we applied for $207,000, received about $206,000. The purpose of the grant is for mitigation around the new resource centers. What we decided to apply for was an effort, a pilot project to assist us with community engagement. The request has 3 FTEs associated with it, 2 that will be contracted with outside entities and 1 that will be a city staff. 1 is will be contracted with Shelter the Homeless that will provide a staff person for both one individual who will serve both resource centers that will be housed at the resource centers and whose primary responsibility is active engagement with the community, residents, businesses, and such.
When you say housed, do you mean office?
Placed, yes, yes, thank you for clarifying. Will be officed at both resource centers, and role will be to engage the community. The second,
David, can I ask for,
Sure.
Is that position comparable to the way that the Midvale Family Shelter has hired basically for 24-hour officer coverage to be that
No.
community liaison component?
No, because the individual at Midvale is focused on public safety. This is not a public safety specific individual. This is community engagement and outreach, relationship building, addressing needs as they arise, trying to address needs before they arise with the community.
And would that be the individual that may staff the community advisory board?
Yeah, Shelter the Homeless will be responsible for putting that board together. I envision that role will be an integral part of that. Whether they will staff it or not, I think will be a decision of Shelter the Homeless.
Okay.
The second component of the city's mitigation fund request for Salt Lake City was an outreach worker with Volunteers of America, specifically to do outreach to unsheltered individuals within a half-mile radius of both resource centers. Now, one of the policy questions is why did we focus there? Because the answer is simple, is that's our focus. Our focus is mitigation around the new resource centers. And so we see outreach and working with individuals experiencing homelessness that are resistant for multiple reasons to accessing the resource centers as a critical component of the success of the resource centers. And so we wanted to have VOAs where the outreach teams exist, and we wanted to have an individual specifically designated for the 2 communities surrounding the resource centers. The third component was to help make sure, one, that we had the staff capacity to actively manage the contract with the 2 providers, organizations, and also make sure that there's a tight link and working relationship between the city processes and the work of these 2 individuals. And so in the grant, we applied for 1 FTE for Salt Lake City to be that single point of contact for the community engagement team.
Thank you, David. And because I had technical difficulties with it, will you remind me when that was submitted, if you've heard back, when you plan to hear back?
We have. So we were awarded all but $800 of it, about, so a little over.
$800,000 of it?
No, all but $800 of it.
Okay.
So $206,000 we were awarded last month. It was submitted, I don't remember the deadline, but late September. The funding itself does not become available until July 1, so it's funding for the new fiscal year. But because of the way the State Homeless Coordinating Committee has to allocate it, that they did the grant application process now.
Great. Thank you.
You're very
thank
welcome.
you for your work to secure those funds and use them in our communities that are host communities for the coming homeless resource centers.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Litvak. Sylvia, anything else?
Nothing.
Thank you for your help and your review of these items. Ben, anything?
Just a clarification for the council. The line item for capital improvements along frequent transit networks that was improved as part of the annual budget started at $1.1 million. If all 4 of the grants that you've heard about tonight that propose to use some of that funding as matching are awarded, that'll bring down the line item to $700,000. And you'll also be hearing about uses for that related to the interlocal agreement with UTA, which will be brought next month. So that line item has a lot of interest in it.
Okay. Thank you for that 10,000-foot perspective. Also, we really appreciate that.
The last thing is the Funding Our Future website. If any of the grants are awarded, that would be the location to communicate to the public what that increased sales tax revenue is going to. And so we would be happy to use some of the material the administration provided in the presentation to put up on the website so the public has access to it to see where the dollars are going.
That's excellent. And they, we're done with the map.
Not the map.
We don't need to talk about the map anymore. All right, thank you both. We have just one more item, council members, on our agenda, and that's the open space sign zoning text amendment, which we have discussed before on November 13th. We had a public hearing that night also. We held a public hearing on we set the public hearing on November 13th. We had a public hearing last week on the 4th. We're set to take action in just over an hour. Across the hall, we have Brian Fulmer, council office staff, and John Anderson, our planning manager. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. In response to some council member questions about what properties would be affected by this text amendment, John created the map that we see up on the screen, and he can explain what the different areas are, and then we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Brian. We appreciate that you took our questions and analyzed the land use around the city. John, do you have anything to add?
Just real quickly, and I actually had help with this map, so I can't take complete credit for it, but anything that's been any color is zoned open space. And so the Planning Commission's recommendation was to remove the cap of 60 square feet and base the amount of signage on what the length of a building would be. That would affect anything that's in the color here, keeping in mind that many of those areas are undevelopable, they're open space, there are not very many large buildings, if any, that would ever exceed that 120-foot length that would even allow you more than 60. And
but I want to interject here that some of the parcels in the northwest area of the map are in the inland port boundaries.
But they are in the natural areas. And so if you can see where it curves around, that's the areas that are zoned M1. But those that are hatched up and above are those that were zoned as natural open space.
That southernmost red hatch of Kennecott owned property, you're telling me is right on the natural area buffer.
Right on there. And it is currently zoned as open space. So everything that was developable, we zoned as M1 now in that area.
Thank you.
And so then we just mapped in yellow, you can see those areas that the applicant had requested an increased amount of signage, but only for those properties that were adjacent to a freeway. And so you can see those outlined there on the map. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Council members, any questions on this one? Councilmember Johnston.
So based on your map, I know before we heard that it wouldn't necessarily have anything comparable anywhere else in the city. Is that still hold true, or are there specific properties right now that would be affected by this potentially? Or specifically, I'm looking at I-80 and 201, I guess. Are there properties that, because they're privately owned or have something on it, could in the future be affected by this?
Yes, and so those, we didn't necessarily find any new ones. I mean, these are ones we'd already identified, and so those same structures like along I-80 would be, the country club. If something in Fairmount Park was built that was large, or the Forestdale Golf Course, for example. And those aren't new examples, but for privately owned parcels of property, they're limited to just the country club, the tennis club, and there's actually a tiny parcel on I-15 right by the sewer plant that's zoned open space and is somehow still privately owned, but has no structures on it.
But everything south of the airport is the Owing Point Golf Course?
Yes.
And theoretically, the airport, if they want to do something else with that land, could then?
Theoretically, but they'd have to find a use that meets, that's in a permitted use in the open space zone. And they're very limited. So they're limited to things like golf courses, outdoor recreation, museums, things of that characteristic. So yes, technically, if the airport authority wanted to build a museum, for example, or something like that, then they would be subject to those.
Councilmember Fowler.
Sorry, or for example, if Wing Point became privately owned and they decided to be able to build a building that was within the golf course in a conditional use, this would apply to them.
Yes. Yeah, they are adjacent. I mean, any of those parcels are adjacent to the freeway. They are zoned open space. So.
Cindy Gus Jensen.
I might be crazy, but didn't the council have to rezone that property as an agreement with the FAA earlier this year? The airport. Yeah. Right. I think we'll have to double check.
We could certainly do
Yeah,
that. I mean,
let's-
if it may not have been, if it wasn't updated in our GIS system or
Right,
something
that
like
could be,
that,
yeah.
I just pulled it straight off the GIS. So.
And I could be
I think
hallucinating.
you're right, and it had to do with the fourth runway option on the west side of the airport property as well.
We did have to rezone it, but it was so it could part of it was that it would also be able to maintain being open space right there as a golf course.
I think that's,
Eventually, I mean,
that's
there was
an option
yeah.
within it.
Yeah, and I mean, it could be very well moot. It's just, I'm curious that if that could
Sure.
happen, if
I mean, it
if
is still
this
on
would
city-owned
apply.
properties, obviously, but yeah.
Okay, council members, any other questions on this one? We are set to take a vote on it at our formal meeting tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian and John.
Thank you very much.
Cindy Gus Jensen, do we have any updates from you? I think we do.
We do. I am not sure if you were notified of this earlier, but I did notice an email from the administration today around noon. There's it looks like a community meeting or a stakeholder meeting on the Fleet Block progress. They will be making a presentation tomorrow at 5 p.m. and the location is Picture Line, 350 West, 700 South. The Fleet Block is something that the council members have for a very long time been very interested in because there is a potential for commercial or housing or a combination thereof. So December 12th, 5 p.m. And then there's a little bit of detail in an email from Melissa at 12, just before 12 today. Okay, then we have vacancies on 2 legislative committees with the pending resignation of Council Member Derek Kitchen. And our policy is silent on how to fill a vacancy if the person resigns from the council. So our policy does say that the subcommittee is made up of the council chair, the RDA board chair, plus a 3rd council member selected by the council. The terms run from April until the end of the next legislative session. So I would think this would be filling a term through April, or excuse me, through the end of the legislative session. So, and then it also says if a council member defers serving on the subcommittee, another council member will be appointed with the council's advice and consent. So that's the first vacancy, is the City Council Subcommittee. And Derek is serving as the RDA chair. The second vacancy is the Utah League of Cities and Towns. They have a policy body that meets, any elected official can attend, but in order to have a vote, you must be a designee that is documented by your city. So our current designees, I believe, are, let's see, Mayor Biskupski and council members Andrew Johnston and council member Kitchen. So there will be a slot that the city can designate due to council member Kitchen's status. So 2 questions there. We don't have to figure it out tonight, but the
Do we need to
legislative
nominate
session
each
is
other? Or is that a volunteer?
either, whatever. We don't have anything in the policy.
Well, I'd like to encourage Councilmember Luke to volunteer to fill that legislative subcommittee space through April.
Sure. Okay.
Well, thank you. Well, I should,
You have to ask if there's anyone else, right?
I just meant thank you for saying sure.
We nominate him to do the other one too?
I'm already there. Usually Wednesdays at noon at the Capitol during the session.
During the session, there's a meeting every week where the utility agencies and towns will talk through legislation and they have some votes about the positions they'll take. Until then, it's monthly meeting in North Salt Lake generally. And
I've tried to do it in the past because of my professional commitments. I can't.
Yeah.
I'm not reliable at that time during the session, so
yeah.
I probably ought not to do it.
And then it's also with the monthly meetings that the league holds.
And you can call into those as well, monthly meetings, so it's not they're all broadcast, so.
I'd be happy to volunteer at this point to fulfill that seat.
Great. Do you want us to straw poll those, Cindy?
I think it seemed like you only have one for each, so I think you're okay.
Great.
There's something I want to just mention as when we get to April, then you'll need to be looking at how to configure the committee, and then you'll go back to RDA chair and council chair, and then the member selected. So let's see, I might have another one. Okay, we have two nominees at least, oh no, three, for the Compensation Advisory Committee. Those have been emailed to you, and we need your feedback on whether you have any opinion about the individuals and whether you would like to arrange small group meetings with those individuals. And then, let's see.
I did respond. Did you get my response on it? Or
Someone must have.
if someone did not, let me know and I'll respond again.
Thank you. Okay. And then I skipped this one, the review of the 2019 calendar. That is included there. And there's one thing we want to draw to your attention, and that is on the selection process to fill the District 4 slot. This was on the last time you received this calendar, but just bringing to your attention, meetings on the 24th, 29th, and/or 31st as part of the selection process. Now, it's possible that you won't need all three of those, but we're pretty sure you'll at least need that first one. So with that, we did make the changes that you discussed last time. Would you like to give us a go-ahead on that calendar, or would you like to take some more time? We can get your okay next Tuesday if that's easier for you. And you also have the right to change it during the year. So you're not signing in blood.
Come back on Tuesday? Yeah, me neither. Or approve now? Okay.
Okay. All right. Then, the item D, the council internal policy on filling a vacancy on the city council. We haven't used this policy in a very long time, and there have been state law changes since we had, since this policy was drafted. And so what staff has done is get advice of the attorney's office, and then has gone through and taken out the things that are not allowed anymore under the law or are unclear. So if you would like, you can spend some more time with this. What what mostly happened is that the state law made it much more transparent. It was pretty transparent before, but there was an opportunity for the council to go into executive session to discuss the character, professional competence, et cetera, of candidates, and that is not an option. The whole process would be in public. So I don't know if you've had a chance to review that, if you received it in enough time, or if you want to hold on that one. We are guided by the state law at this point, so no rush to adopt this.
Unless anyone wants to adopt it right now.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm okay with it.
Okay.
I've had
Okay.
time to look at it.
Right. I just been
Any objections?
okay. Just trying not to box you in.
And that's all? Okay, there's no report of the chair and vice chair. We don't have a closed session, so we're going to end this meeting and meet across the hall at 7.
The report, but what I will tell you what was recommended for funding. I know because I'm on the committee.
Will you come up to the mic, Jennifer, and introduce yourself?
As I was walking out the door, I received a text that the Salt Lake County Council did vote on the grant application recommendations. I can't see exactly what they decided in terms of dollar amounts, but I can tell you what was recommended from the mayor's office and staff for funding. And so for the applications that you heard about tonight, it's the Second South Mobility Hub, the West Side Mobility Hub, the 9 Line, the State Street project, and the Salt Lake Mill Creek Holiday South Salt Lake circulation study. So 5.
Exciting.
I will send you details as soon as I have them. I'll just send an
Hope
email
that's
to
what happens.
staff. It's really exciting.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we're done. Thanks.
To Salt Lake City government. On this week's episode, we hear from Salt Lake City firefighter Virginia Dickinson about her experience fighting the Woolsey Fire in Southern California. And our History Minute is about the 8th installment of our History of Rail. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its November 27th meeting, the City Council recognized Councilmember Derek Kitchen for 3 years of service on the City Council and 2 years of leadership on the Redevelopment Agency. Kitchen will leave January 2019 to begin serving in the Utah State Legislature. The council was also briefed on the potential for the city to host a future Winter Olympics. To learn more, visit slccouncil.com. For the first time ever, the United Nations Global Communications NGO Conference is coming to Salt Lake City in August of 2019. Mayor Biskupski, United Nations officials, along with local dignitaries, announced plans to host the 68th annual conference, focusing on empowering sustainable communities. Next year's conference will showcase Salt Lake City's work to help lead the way on global issues. Salt Lake City is the first location in the nation outside of New York City to host this conference, bringing the most international audience to Utah since the 2002 Olympics. In early November, a devastating fire ravaged the Southern California area of Thousand Oaks, and 9 Salt Lake City firefighters were deployed to help assist with the Woolsey fire, including firefighter Virginia Dickinson. On this week's Capital City News episode, we hear her story and what it was like.
My name is V. Dickinson. I'm a firefighter with Salt Lake City Fire Department. I've been on the job now coming up on 2.5 years, so still very new to the career. But I graduated with a BA into the recession, spent 7 years in sales, and realized I didn't want to spend my life making somebody else money. I needed to have more purpose in life. And I actually went to a public safety career fair at the public safety building downtown. And the firefighters said, "Hey, you should be a firefighter." It's like, that's a really good idea. So I tested, I went through the process, and here I am. And like I said, I can't imagine doing anything else. I know that this was what I'm supposed to do. As we start watching the news, you hear about these fires, you kind of perk your ear. And then you know, especially as Campfire grew, as Woolsey grew, you knew that there was a possibility that we could be sending a team. And I got the phone call from the chief. He said, "Are you willing to deploy tomorrow to go to California?" I said, "Absolutely, I want to help. I want to go do my part." And I know that every single one of us feels that way. We took 2 apparatus and 9 members from Salt Lake City, and we were part of the Utah Task Force. So we went with a lot of different agencies throughout the state. My engineer here at Station 9 was my engineer on deployment. So that was really neat to get to go with somebody who I have a really close relationship with already. You know, he's like a big brother to me. The command scale when you get to camp is a huge learning experience, but it was overwhelming. You get there and there are engines from Texas, from Montana, from Utah, and then you see just how many CAL FIRE engines there are, and that they're calling in for help with the resources that they have. It's a very powerful experience. My favorite part about being a firefighter is the family. You live, sleep, eat, go into dangerous situations with your crew. And that extends to any agency. When you go out and you're assigned a task force or you're assigned a division with different people and people that you've never met before, it doesn't matter. They're your brothers and sisters, and you feel that camaraderie. You're one tiny little cog in a huge machine, and it's just this common cause. Everybody's fighting for the same goal. I feel so grateful that I was picked to go. I was on that list. It was an immense learning experience for me, especially being somebody so new on the job. You know, when you flip on the news in the morning, you see all of the bad things that happen out there, the natural disasters, the human disasters, all of the negativity in the world. And it was really important for me as I made this career change, or as I stumbled into this career, that I wanted to be part of the good guys. You know, I wanted to know that in some small, tiny way, I'm making somebody else's life a little bit better. And that is single-handedly why I'm here, and why when you get that call to deploy, there's no question. It says, I'm going. I want to go help. I want to go do my part.
And now it's time for our History Minute.
As soon as E.H. Harriman took control of the Salt Lake streetcar system, he began updating the trains, modernized the maintenance shops, power lines, plants, and everything else. Harriman then commissioned a state-of-the-art facility to house and maintain his ever-increasing fleet of streetcars. As the new home of public transit in Salt Lake City, Harriman chose a 10-acre plot of land on the east side that had been set aside by Brigham Young as the 10th Ward Square, then designated in 1889 as the official territorial fairgrounds. By 1902, it was too small to be used in that capacity and was abandoned. Harriman scooped it up and constructed the massive building that we know today as Trolley Square. This building could hold 144 double-truck streetcars. It was divided into 4 massive bays with 4 tracks each. 208 skylights provided the light for the building. Because fire was always a risk, Harriman included the now iconic 50,000-gallon water tower to the plans, hoping to keep the entire operation self-sufficient. In an effort to remain completely independent, he even had blacksmiths and carpenters on site, building spare parts by hand so there would be no delay in shipping parts across the prairie to keep the Salt Lake City streetcars functioning.
Thanks for watching another episode of Capital City News. Be sure to tune in next time to stay up to date on all the latest. Now through December, Salt Lake City is hosting the 35th annual Holiday Craft Market. Be sure to get out and do your holiday shopping the local way. For details, visit saltlakearts.org. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar signing off from the Public Safety Building. joining us for SLC TV, Salt Lake City's Government Access Channel. The holiday season is upon us, and so is the countdown to find the perfect gift for your loved one. On this week's episode of Capital City News, we hear from Laura Fritz, the director of Salt Lake City's Economic Development Department, about Small Business Saturday and shopping local. And our History Minute is about renowned painter and sculptor Alan Hauser. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its November 13th meeting, the City Council received updates on the regulation of inland port uses, major public utilities projects, surplus land for affordable housing, and more. The Council also passed an anti-puppy mill ordinance limiting the sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits at commercial.
It's about 40% if you shop at a big box store. So more of the dollar remains in the community and recycles through the community. So shopping small is really important from an economic standpoint. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, we are in partnership with Local First Utah doing a Small Business Saturday event called the 9-Line Shop Small Crawl, and it is going to go from 9th East to 9th West, all along South 900 South, and we're really excited. Businesses are going to have passports that you can stop at various businesses and get stamps and get put into a drawing for gifts. And we know that the business owners are excited to meet you and to talk about their business and hopefully help you with your holiday shopping. For more information about the Small Business Saturday 9-Line Shop Small Crawl, visit the website below.
Next up is our History Minute.
On the northeast corner of Washington Square is a bronze statue of a Native American offering a pipe up to the sky. Hundreds walk by it daily, but few know its story, and even fewer realize it might be one of the most important works of art on display in all of Salt Lake City. It was sculpted by Alan Hauser, a Chiricahua Apache painter, sculptor, and illustrator who was born in 1914 and passed away in 1994. His first major commission was a pair of murals inside the main interior building in Washington, D.C., alongside artists like Maynard Dixon and William Gropper. In 1949, Hauser's art earned him a Guggenheim Fellowship in Sculpture and Painting. Afterward, he accepted a job teaching art in Utah at the Intermountain Intertribal School for the next 11 years. In 1985, he presented the United Nations with a bronze sculpture called Offering of the Sacred Pipe. In 1992, he became the first Native American to receive a National Medal of the Arts. May We Have Peace was the reason for his last visit to Washington, D.C. before his passing, where he presented the bronze sculpture to then First Lady Hillary Clinton for installation at the vice presidential residence. But in 2002, as the Olympics came to Salt Lake City, the Alan Hauser Estate loaned 19 works of art for display during the event. The Salt Lake Foundation made it their goal to acquire permanently this casting of the important statue. Other castings of May We Have Peace are placed in major museum collections around the United States, including the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for joining us for another episode. Wishing you and your family a happy holiday season. Be sure to get out and shop local this year. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar, signing off from the Jordan River Trail. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. On this week's episode, we hear from Salt Lake City firefighter Virginia Dickinson about her experience fighting the Woolsey Fire in Southern California. And our History Minute is about the 8th installment of our History of Rail. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its November 27th meeting, the City Council recognized Councilmember Derek Kitchen for 3 years of service on the City Council and 2 years of leadership on the Redevelopment Agency. Kitchen will leave January 2019 to begin serving in the Utah State Legislature. The Council was also briefed on the potential for the city to host a future Winter Olympics. To learn more, visit slccouncil.com. For the first time ever, the United Nations Global Communications NGO Conference is coming to Salt Lake City in August of 2019. Mayor Biskupski, United Nations officials, along with local dignitaries, announced plans to host the 68th annual conference, focusing on empowering sustainable communities. Next year's conference will showcase Salt Lake City's work to help lead the way on global issues. Salt Lake City is the first location in the nation outside of New York City to host this conference, bringing the most international audience to Utah since the 2002 Olympics. In early November, a devastating fire ravaged the Southern California area of Thousand Oaks, and 9 Salt Lake City firefighters were deployed to help assist with the Woolsey fire, including firefighter Virginia Dickinson. On this week's Capital City News episode, we hear her story and what it was like.
My name is V. Dickinson. I'm a firefighter with Salt Lake City Fire Department. I've been on the job now coming up on 2.5 years, so still very new to the career. But I graduated with a BA into the recession, spent 7 years in sales, and realized I didn't want to spend my life making somebody else money. I needed to have more purpose in life. And I actually went to a public safety career fair at the public safety building downtown. And the firefighters said, "Hey, you should be a firefighter." It's like, that's a really good idea. So I tested, I went through the process, and here I am. And like I said, I can't imagine doing anything else. I know that this was what I'm supposed to do. As we start watching the news, you hear about these fires, you kind of perk your ear. And then you know, especially as Camp Fire grew, as Woolsey grew, you knew that there was a possibility that we could be sending a team. And I got the phone call from the chief. He said, "Are you willing to deploy tomorrow to go to California?" I said, "Absolutely. I want to help. I want to go do my part." And I know that every single one of us feels that way. We took 2 apparatus and 9 members from Salt Lake City, and we were part of the Utah Task Force. So we went with a lot of different agencies throughout the state. My engineer here at Station 9 was my engineer on deployment. So that was really neat to get to go with somebody who I have a really close relationship with already. You know, he's like a big brother to me. The command scale when you get to camp is a huge learning experience, but it was overwhelming. You get there and there are engines from Texas, from Montana, from Utah, and then you see just how many CAL FIRE engines there are, and that they're calling in for help with the resources that they have. It's a very powerful experience. My favorite part about being a firefighter is the family. You live, sleep, eat, go into dangerous situations with your crew. And that extends to any agency. When you go out and you're assigned a task force or you're assigned a division with different people and people that you've never met before, it doesn't matter. They're your brothers and sisters, and you feel that camaraderie. You're one tiny little cog in a huge machine, and it's just this common cause. Everybody's fighting for the same goal. I feel so grateful that I was picked to go. I was on that list. It was an immense learning experience for me, especially being somebody so new on the job. You know, when you flip on the news in the morning, you see all of the bad things that happen out there, the natural disasters, the human disasters, all of the negativity in the world. And it was really important for me as I made this career change, as I stumbled into this career, that I wanted to be part of the good guys. You know, I wanted to know that in some small, tiny way, I'm making somebody else's life a little bit better. And that is single-handedly why I'm here, and why when you get that call to deploy, there's no question. It says, I'm going. I want to go help. I want to go do my part.
And now it's time for our History Minute.
As soon as E.H. Harriman took control of the Salt Lake streetcar system, he began updating the trains, modernized the maintenance shops, power lines, plants, and everything else. Harriman then commissioned a state-of-the-art facility to house and maintain his ever-increasing fleet of streetcars. As the new home of public transit in Salt Lake City, Harriman chose a 10-acre plot of land on the east side that had been set aside by Brigham Young as the 10th Ward Square, then designated in 1889 as the official territorial fairgrounds. By 1902, it was too small to be used in that capacity and was abandoned. Harriman scooped it up and constructed the massive building that we know today as Trolley Square. This building could hold 144 double-truck streetcars. It was divided into 4 massive bays with 4 tracks each. 208 skylights provided the light for the building. Because fire was always a risk, Harriman included the now iconic 50,000-gallon water tower to the plans, hoping to keep the entire operation self-sufficient. In an effort to remain completely independent, he even had blacksmiths and carpenters on site, building spare parts by hand so there would be no delay in shipping parts across the prairie to keep the Salt Lake City streetcars functioning.
Thanks for watching another episode of Capital City News. Be sure to tune in next time to stay up to date on all the latest. Now through December, Salt Lake City is hosting the 35th annual Holiday Craft Market. Be sure to get out and do your holiday shopping the local way. For details, visit saltlakearts.org. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar signing off from the Public Safety Building. Thanks for joining us for SLC TV, Salt Lake City's Government Access Channel. The holiday season is upon us, and so is the countdown to find the perfect gift for your loved one. On this week's episode of Capital City News, we hear from Laura Fritz, the director of Salt Lake City's Economic Development Department, about Small Business Saturday and shopping local. And our History Minute is about renowned painter and sculptor Alan Hauser. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its November 13th meeting, the City Council received updates on the regulation of inland port uses, major public utilities projects, surplus land for affordable housing, and more. The Council also passed an anti-puppy mill ordinance limiting the sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits at commercial animal establishments. To learn more, visit slccouncil.com. With global temperatures on the rise, Utah is feeling the effects of climate change. Low water levels, algal blooms, poor air quality, extreme heat, frequent wildfires. Help be part of the solution. Take action today. Small changes to your daily routine will reduce emissions and help you save. Adjust thermostat settings. Every degree saves 3% on heating or cooling. Use cold water for washing clothes. Heating water consumes a lot of energy. Go vegetarian 1 day per week. Food is 25% of Utah household carbon footprint. Act now on climate change. Find more helpful tips at slc.gov/sustainability. The day after Thanksgiving kicks off holiday shopping season. Laura Fritz, the director of Salt Lake City's Economic Development Department, reminds us of Small Business Saturday and where you can shop local.
Small Business Saturday is a really important event for Salt Lake City and really communities across the country to highlight our local businesses, to encourage people to shop small. When you walk into a small business, most of the time you get to meet the owners. And so we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to meet our business owners here in Salt Lake City. Every dollar that is spent at a local small business is about 70% of that is returned back to the local community. Unlike it's about 40% if you shop at a big box store. So more of the dollar remains in the community and recycles through the community. So shopping small is really important from an economic standpoint. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, we are in partnership with Local First Utah, doing a Small Business Saturday event called the 9-Line Shop Small Crawl, and it is going to go from 9th East to 9th West, all along South 900 South, and we're really excited. Businesses are going to have passports that you can stop at various businesses and get stamps and get put into a drawing for gifts. And we know that the business owners are excited to meet you and to talk about their business and hopefully help you with your holiday shopping. For more information about the Small Business Saturday 9-Line Shop Small Crawl, visit the website below.
Next up is our History Minute.
On the northeast corner of Washington Square is a bronze statue of a Native American offering a pipe up to the sky. Hundreds walk by it daily, but few know its story, and even fewer realize it might be one of the most important works of art on display in all of Salt Lake City. It was sculpted by Alan Hauser, a Chiricahua Apache painter, sculptor, and illustrator who was born in 1914 and passed away in 1994. His first major commission was a pair of murals inside the main interior building in Washington, D.C., alongside artists like Maynard Dixon and William Gropper. In 1949, Hauser's art earned him a Guggenheim Fellowship in Sculpture and Painting. Afterward, he accepted a job teaching art in Utah at the Intermountain Intertribal School for the next 11 years. In 1985, he presented the United Nations with a bronze sculpture called Offering of the Sacred Pipe. In 1992, he became the first Native American to receive a National Medal of the Arts. May We Have Peace was the reason for his last visit to Washington, D.C. before his passing, where he presented the bronze sculpture to then First Lady Hillary Clinton for installation at the vice presidential residence. But in 2002, as the Olympics came to Salt Lake City, the Alan Hauser Estate loaned 19 works of art for display during the event. The Salt Lake Foundation made it their goal to acquire permanently this casting of the important statue. Other castings of May We Have Peace are placed in major museum collections around the United States, including the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for joining us for another episode. Wishing you and your family a happy holiday season. Be sure to get out and shop local this year. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar, signing off from the Jordan River Trail. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. On this week's episode, we hear from Salt Lake City firefighter Virginia Dickinson about her experience fighting the Woolsey Fire in Southern California. And our History Minute is about the 8th installment of our History of Rail. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back. At its November 27th meeting, the City Council recognized Councilmember Derek Kitchen for 3 years of service on the City Council and 2 years of leadership on the Redevelopment Agency. Kitchen will leave January 2019 to begin serving in the Utah State Legislature. The Council was also briefed on the potential for the city to host a future Winter Olympics. To learn more, visit slccouncil.com. For the first time ever, the United Nations Global Communications NGO Conference is coming to Salt Lake City in August of 2019. Mayor Biskupski, United Nations officials, along with local dignitaries, announced plans to host the 68th annual conference focusing on empowering sustainable communities. Next year's conference will showcase Salt Lake City's work to help lead the way on global issues. Salt Lake City is the first location in the nation outside of New York City to host this conference, bringing the most international audience to Utah since the 2002 Olympics. In early November, a devastating fire ravaged the Southern California area of Thousand Oaks, and 9 Salt Lake City firefighters were deployed to help assist with the Woolsey Fire, including firefighter Virginia Dickinson. On this week's Capital City News episode, we hear her story and what it was like.
My name is V. Dickinson. I'm a firefighter with Salt Lake City Fire Department. I've been on the job now coming up on 2.5 years, so still very new to the career. But I graduated with a BA into the recession, spent 7 years in sales, and realized I didn't want to spend my life making somebody else money. I needed to have more purpose in life. And I actually went to a public safety career fair at the public safety building downtown. And the firefighters said, "Hey, you should be a firefighter." It's like, that's a really good idea. So I tested, I went through the process, and here I am. And like I said, I can't imagine doing anything else. I know that this was what I'm supposed to do. As we start watching the news, you hear about these fires, you kind of perk your ear. And then you know, especially as Camp Fire grew, as Woolsey grew, you knew that there was a possibility that we could be sending a team. And I got the phone call from the chief. He said, "Are you willing to deploy tomorrow to go to California?" I said, "Absolutely. I want to help. I want to go do my part." And I know that every single one of us feels that way. We took 2 apparatus and 9 members from Salt Lake City, and we were part of the Utah Task Force. So we went with a lot of different agencies throughout the state. My engineer here at Station 9 was my engineer on deployment. So that was really neat to get to go with somebody who I have a really close relationship with already. You know, he's like a big brother to me. The command scale when you get to camp is a huge learning experience, but it was overwhelming. You get there and there are engines from Texas, from Montana, from Utah, and then you see just how many CAL FIRE engines there are and that they're calling in for help with the resources that they have. It's a very powerful experience. My favorite part about being a firefighter is the family. You live, sleep, eat, go into dangerous situations with your crew. And that extends to any agency. When you go out and you're assigned a task force or you're assigned a division with different people and people that you've never met before, it doesn't matter. They're your brothers and sisters, and you feel that camaraderie. You're one tiny little cog in a huge machine, and it's just this common cause. Everybody's fighting for the same goal. I feel so grateful that I was picked to go. I was on that list. It was an immense learning experience for me, especially being somebody so new on the job. You know, when you flip on the news in the morning, you see all of the bad things that happen out there, the natural disasters, the human disasters, all of the negativity in the world. And it was really important for me as I made this career change, as I stumbled into this career, that I wanted to be part of the good guys. You know, I wanted to know that in some small, tiny way, I'm making somebody else's life a little bit better. And that is single-handedly why I'm here, and why when you get that call to deploy, there's no question. It says, I'm going. I want to go help. I want to go do my part.
And now it's time for our History Minute.
As soon as E.H. Harriman took control of the Salt Lake streetcar system, he began updating the trains, modernized the maintenance shops, power lines, plants, and everything else. Harriman then commissioned a state-of-the-art facility to house and maintain his ever-increasing fleet of streetcars. As the new home of public transit in Salt Lake City, Harriman chose a 10-acre plot of land on the east side that had been set aside by Brigham Young as the 10th Ward Square, then designated in 1889 as the official territorial fairgrounds. By 1902, it was too small to be used in that capacity and was abandoned. Harriman scooped it up and constructed the massive building that we know today as Trolley Square. This building could hold 144 double-truck streetcars. It was divided into 4 massive bays with